Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to make a couple announcements, everybody who's on the line. We're going to start pretty quickly here. This event is recorded for educational use by the University of California. You're muted pretty much the whole time, but if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A section at the bottom, not in the chat. Questions are addressed at the conclusion of each presentation if there's time, or we'll do them at the end of the meeting. Again, chat is for non-questions or comments. You can make sure that you want to, if you can select who you're messaging to in the chat. And then the last important thing for DPR credits, during this entire meeting, we'll be launching little mini quizzes via the poll feature in Zoom. So if you're on with video, their computer today, go ahead and answer those questions and pay attention to them, because after this event, you will be emailed a quiz. It's the final in order to get the credits, and you'll have to answer those questions and pass with a 70%. But there is an option to retake it. So that will be sent to you within about 24 hours after this meeting, and you'll need to complete it within about a week. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Oleg.
All right, thank you, Kelly. Well, this is our new way of trying to accomplish our meeting objectives. We'll see how that goes. Appreciate everybody's patience in getting logged in and paying attention and following through with this. We have agenda from 8:30 till about 11:50. We'll take a break in the middle. We'll hear from Kelly as far as facilitation of the individual talks afterwards, and she'll remind us of things that we need to take care of. With that, I'd like to go ahead and start with our presentation set. Our first speaker will be Andy Calderwood from Ventura County Ag Commissioner's Office. Andy will kindly join us to provide an update on the situation with fumigants and regulations in Ventura County that are pertinent to us, at the strawberry industry, and he will take it all from here. Andy?
Oh, I thought we were starting at 8:45. Okay.
We're starting at 8:30.
Okay, sounds good. Is this a good voice level? All right.
Yes.
So my name's Andy Calderwood. I'm with the Ag Commissioner's Office, and my program is pesticide use enforcement. And so I've just got some regulatory updates. There's not a lot changing on the fumigant front. There's some stuff coming up, but not a lot that has happened recently. Let's next slide. Who's advancing my slide? Oh, there we go. So these are kind of the things I want to go over. There are some proposed regulations on the posting of field fumigation and some Ppe exemptions. There are some changes to Paraquat. I know it's not a fumigant, but certainly strawberry growers use it. Also some changes to carbaryl, and there'll be some upcoming changes to 1,3-D. I don't really have much to say on Neo-Nicotinoids. That's actually been kind of shelved by DPR, but I can say a little bit about that at the end. Next slide, please. So this is just a sort of a summary of fume activity in Ventura County. This is thanks to Scott Wilson on our staff for entering all of our fumigations into GIS. This is sort of a snapshot of the year 2019. As you can see, the top crop for fumigation in the county is strawberry, with almost 10,000 acres fumigated. You can see that the biggest fumigant used is chloropicrin at about 6,600 acres. 1,3-D is fairly heavily used, about 20% of the fumigations, and all of the 1,3-D in this presentation, all of the fumigated plots include fumigations that have chloropicrin as well. So just keep that in mind. And you can also see from this table that methyl bromide has all but gone away. It's used for a few quarantine-specific purposes in the nursery setting. Essentially, all other uses are no longer allowed. So we can see the top crops are berries. I call them chiles. They're called peppers too. So chiles are also a big crop. Tomatoes are down quite a bit. We used to fumigate a lot more tomatoes, but the tomato market's not doing so well. Next slide. There we go. So this is what the fumigation looks like. There are a few places in the Santa Clara Valley that aren't on this map, out toward Piru and Giberson Road and that sort of thing. But this is where most of the fumigations take place, on the Oxnard Plain, and you can see that chloropicrin, the yellow there, does dominate. Kind of west of Wood Road, the Strawberry areas, there's a lot of chloropicrin used there, El Rio, and in the Ventura area. Metam sodium is also used, but not really so much on strawberries. It's used for other crops. Next. So this next section is some proposed changes for the regulations around field fumigation posting. And these derive from some recent changes in the Worker Protection Standard, and this is just to make our regulations conform more tightly with that. Next slide, please. So just a reminder that these are the signs that have to go around the fumigated field, warning that the field needs to be fumigated. This part isn't new, but just a refresher that the signs need to be up at all points of approach. And I've given indicated where the signs, those white rectangles, ought to be on a field of this size. This size is more than half a mile long. This plot is, and along every public right-of-way, the signs need to be spaced at least at a 600-foot interval. So if there's a farm road approaching the field, something like that, the spirit of the thing is any place where somebody's going to come upon the field, they have to encounter one of these signs so that they know that the field is under fumigation. Next slide. So I say old. Currently, the regulations regarding posting for field fumigation, which is treated separately in the code from other posting requirements, but for fumigation, the responsible party is not not specified. So it just says that signs shall be posted in such and such manner. The new language conforms with what's found in other parts of the code regarding non-fumigations. The operator of the property is the one responsible for having the signs up. So next slide. So this is what the new regulation will look like if it's adopted unchanged. It's still being reviewed for, they're addressing comments and that sort of thing right now. So it says, when a fumigant is applied to a field, the operator of the property shall assure that fields are posted with field fumigation warning signs in the manner specified in D, etc. So this makes it clear in the code that the obligation for the signs in field fumigations lies on the property operator. Next. In the old or the current situation, the signs are to be removed when aeration is complete. But for some fumigations, there isn't a formal aeration period. For instance, untarped fumigations. You know, if you've got a tarp fumigation, the tarps are cut and then aeration is completed after a certain number of days after the cutting. That's clear. But if there isn't a defined aeration period, then it's a little hard to say when aeration is complete. So the new signs have to be, the new code says that the signs will have to be removed when the entry restricted period expires. So next. So this is what it'll look like in Code of Regulations. When a fumigant is applied to a field, the operator of the property shall assure that field fumigation warning signs remain posted and clearly legible for the duration of the entry restricted period. So whatever that is, depending on regulation or label, that's when the signs have to remain. Next. So in the old, or I should say the current code, the legibility of the signs is not mentioned. In the new, it stresses that the signs must remain legible. So if they're printed in such a manner that they fade in the sun and are not legible for the entire duration of the time when the signs must be up, then they will be out of compliance. So next slide. So this is the same thing I showed you before, but only now the "and clearly legible" is emphasized. So field fumigation warning signs must remain posted and clearly legible for the duration of the entry restricted period. And again, these are proposed. The comment period ended last summer, and they're still working on addressing comments. Probably COVID-19 has pushed that back a little too. Next slide. The old code said that label signage is not mentioned, so the new code will specify that what needs to be on the sign, and will also add plus anything else that is specified by the label. So currently, if you don't put something on the sign which is specified by the label, you'd be in violation of 12.973 of the Food and Ag Code for conflict with label. But this new language will make will put the obligation on the property operator to put that language up as well, and will mean that a violation by not putting something on the sign which is required by the label would also be a violation of the worker protection part of the California Code of Regulations. So let's look at the language. Next slide. So it says when a fumigant is applied, field fumigation warning signs containing the following information instead of the information specified in B, which is the stuff for other signage, are used. And you have to have the skull and crossbones, following statements, danger, peligro, etc. And then C has been added, other information as specified by the pesticide product labeling. So like I said, right now you'd only be in violation of 12.973 of the Food and Ag Code, but coming up, not putting up what's required by the label would put you in violation of California Code of Regulations, worker protection section as well. That information might be things like who the applicator is and contact information for the applicator, that sort of thing. Okay, next slide. Oh, okay, that's just an example. Down at the bottom, the date and time of fumigation, name of the applicator, those are things that are not required by the code, but are label requirements. And so this part of the code requires them as well. Next slide. In addition, there are some Ppe exemptions that are also part of this regulatory package, again related to the work protection standard, the federal standard. When an employee is using a closed system or an enclosed cab, employer shall assure Ppe specified on the labeling is within reach of the employee. So under this section of the code, if you're using a closed system for certain materials, or if you're using an enclosed cab, some of the Ppe that might be required by the label or otherwise required by regulations is not required to be used. The cab or the closed system is adequately protective, but it's required that that Ppe be available. That's what the current requirement is. And so this just specifies that it doesn't just need to be on site, it needs to be within reach of the employee. So if you're in an enclosed cab, it has to be somewhere where he can get to it quickly. The idea is if something goes wrong, if the enclosed cab, there's a breach or something, a window breaks, and now a person needs to have a respirator or something, then that needs to be within reach of the employee. So that's that change. Next one. There have been some changes in Paraquat. This stemmed from reports by both the California Poison Control System and the American Association of Poison Control Centers that reported on a rash of accidental deaths, more than 50 in just a several-year period, many of them in the California Central Valley, and an alarming number of them from accidental drinks from beverage containers. Gatorade is the biggest culprit. It's amazing, but people are still using, we're still finding this, people are using Gatorade containers and things like that as service containers. We just had a priority case where this was done in a home setting. Somebody had acquired some pesticide from a landscaper, and the landscaper just asked for a container, and it was poured into a Gatorade container, and then I think his wife drank from it because it was stored under the sink. So there was no death there, but Paraquat is a very nasty corrosive material. If you drink a sip of it, it will start to eat away at your esophagus. You won't die instantly from it, but you'll be in agony, and people can die 2 weeks later due to liver and kidney failure. So it's a very bad news. There's no antidote if you drink some of this. So if you gulp down a lethal dose, then you're through. So EPA has taken measures to prevent this from happening again. So next slide. So these are the mitigations. They're now going to require that only certified applicators can handle this product. As you know, with most restricted materials, they can be handled by a non-certified applicator under the supervision of a certified applicator. So for most restricted materials, the application needs to be supervised by a certified person. Now the handler himself has to be certified. It has to be QAL, QAC, pilot, that sort of thing, to be able to use this product. You have to pass an online course, which again emphasizes the toxicity of the product and not to put it into beverage containers, that sort of thing. It's a fairly short course. I'm told it takes about 25 minutes, readily available online. And the label also stresses toxicity of the chemical. So next slide, I think I have some illustrations of these things. So this is the new language that's on the new Paraquat labels. So it says for use only by certified applicators, and then it says not to be used by uncertified persons working under the supervision of a certified applicator. So that's the new language. Next slide. And next one, there we go. So this is what it looks like when you go to take the online course. It's very straightforward. The link will be on any of the Paraquat labels. It's easy to find just by Googling it. This is not a hard hurdle for anybody to get over, but in order to use this, you have to pass this course. Next. And there we go. So this is the new language, some of the new language that is going to be on the label. Danger, fatal if swallowed or inhaled. Never transfer this product into food or beverage containers or containers not explicitly intended for pesticides. Never use this product in residential or public recreational settings, home gardens, schools, etc. This product is toxic! Exclamation point. So there's a lot of additional language to make it as clear as possible that this is a dangerous product. Next slide, please. And this is language that's going to be required on the cap itself. So the cap will say, danger, 1 sip can kill in English and Spanish. Next slide. Oh, could you go back one more slide? One more. Sorry. And then also the fourth hazard mitigation, which I didn't have a picture for, was the no-pour container. So the idea is that Gramoxone is, Paraquat is, they don't want you to be able to pour it into a Gatorade container. So it'll have a valve on it that will prevent you from being able to do that. It will be a no-pour container. Currently, some people have submitted language that will go along with this container to US EPA. And as of earlier this year, DPR has not received any of these new labels for the new containers. Apparently, after they're approved by US EPA, they'll have 12 months to only be producing those kinds of containers. The registrant will. So it'll probably be sometime next year that registrants will only be producing these no-pour containers. So the idea is, you can't pour it, so it has to be used with a closed system. It has to be used with some sort of extractor that will transfer it without any opportunity to put it into a beverage container. Next slide, please. A change in carbaryl. The risk characterization documents, these are routinely done by DPR and US EPA to evaluate hazards posed by pesticides. They use this by, it's called the, I forget the, never mind. They use it by evaluating, estimating exposures under certain conditions. So they'll, estimate what the exposure would be if, like in this case, a residential handler applying by backpack. What will be his dermal exposure? What will be his inhalation exposure? What would be the exposure to people who go into that area after he's made the treatments? And then they compare those with the no observable effect level. And this is the level above which there is going to be some sort of observed effect in, say, laboratory rats. Rats lose weight, or if you're talking about aquatic systems, a certain number of fish or fairy shrimp will die. The level at which you observe an effect is, you might call that the scary level. So what they do is they estimate exposures and then compare it to that scary level, and they look for a factor of 100. So they want exposures that they estimate under various scenarios to be at least 100 times lower than this no observable effect level. And when they did these risk characterization documents for carbaryl, they found that there were some situations where the estimated exposure was too close to that level, was too high, and that was residential handlers using backpack or dust, residential re-entry onto treated turf. So if you use carbaryl on lawns and then people went and played on the lawn, that estimated exposure was deemed to be too high. And then toddler exposure by ingestion. By, little kids will eat dirt, they'll eat anything. So if there was a treatment in around a home, then it was estimated that exposures to toddlers by ingestion was of concern. So next slide. So effective August of this year, all carbaryl formulations will be California restricted materials, with one exception. And that's baits labeled for production of an agricultural plant commodity. So it's only baits and only for ag plant commodities. There were some other exceptions that have been removed. And so the idea is this essentially takes it out of the residential use. And so it's only going to be used in agricultural settings. And you could use it like a structural company could still use it, but then it's going to be applied by a professional who understands the hazards that are there and will apply it responsibly, presumably. So, so essentially, except for those baits, it will be requiring a permit for use. So next slide. 1,3-D, and next slide, please. So the DPR does monitoring, air monitoring for volatile compounds, pesticides, and they've been doing this for some years. There are, I think, 8 stations statewide, and several of them in the Central Valley. We have one here in Ventura County at El Rio by the Rio Mesa High School. That site was chosen locally just because it's Rio Mesa High School is surrounded entirely by strawberries, and that was considered a good place to see what kind of the highest levels we might expect to see in the county would be. So there were some recent tests, one in Parlier in 2017, Shafter 2018, and Parlier in 2018, that showed levels that were above or too close to regulatory targets. I'm happy to say that due to the efforts of Blanca Enriquez Prat and others in our staff, we've come through with flying colors on our air monitoring here in Ventura, and we do a very good job of evaluating notices of intent and making sure that everybody adheres strictly to these measures. And we came out with flying colors, but not so in some applications in the Central Valley. And so those have prompted DPR to decide that additional mitigation for 1,3-D will be needed to protect bystanders. Next slide. So this is 1,3-D use in Ventura County 2019. And what we're showing in this chart are the different methods that are used. The dark blue is non-tarp deep broadcast. So this is when it's shanked in and there's no tarp put down. That's about 10% of our applications. The pink one there is Fumigation with a tarp. That sort of turquoise one on the bottom right is tarp shallow broadcast with a TIF tarp. This is a tarp that gives 60% buffer reduction credits. So if it's being shanked in shallow with a tarp, that's about 1/3 of our applications, and then about half are Fumigations with tarp, and again with a TIF tarp. So most people, as you can see, about 80% of our applications locally are being done with TIF tarps of 1,3-D. So next slide, please. So this looks at 1,3-D use with the various commodities. So you can see that, again, strawberries are the biggest user. About 80% of the 1,3-D is used for strawberries. Raspberries next, blackberries. Oops, that my graph didn't, my Excel skills weren't up to it. The chiles are 171, so they're actually second ahead of raspberries. So, so this just kind of gives an idea of the which methods are used for, like the non-tarp deep broadcast, the 1206 That's primarily used for the peppers, whereas the Fumigation and the TIF use is primarily what they're doing on strawberries. So next slide. So these aren't things that have been settled on. These are options being mulled by DPR to mitigate the hazard. So prohibit applications during December, presumably having to do with inversions in the Central Valley. Require tarps, require a field management plan, other stuff that they're kind of already doing. Cap application blocks, require a permanent distance to an occupied structure of 200 feet. And then options for making sure that multiple applications done at the same time are accounted for, and that their acreages are summed. Next slide, please. These are borrowed from DPR, some of these slides. I hope they don't mind. So this is what the most popular method statewide is the 1206 method. Remember, that's the non-TARP applications. And you can see that if they use 332 pounds, that the current buffer zones are relatively small. But if they want protection of either 110 parts per billion or 55 parts per billion standards, they're going to have to increase the buffer zones significantly, for up to 1 and almost 2,000 feet for that method. Next slide. And so this is contrasting with the 1242 method, which is also used in our county. And this is application broadcast with the totally impermeable film. And these films seem to really work. We did testing of 10 last year. DPR was interested in whether the TIF films were living up to their billing, that the manufacturing standards were keeping them as totally impermeable films, and apparently they were. There were none kicked back as not meeting specs. But you can see the buffer zones are all small if you use these tarps. And so that's good news because most of our applications with 1,3-D locally do use totally impermeable films. So expected mitigation measures might not have a big impact on local use. Next slide. Another option has to do with extending the time for before the interval before you cut the tarp. And as you can see from the graph on the right, if you cut a tarp in 9 days, you have a very large spike. And if you cut a tarp 14 days later, the spike is less than half the size. And that's sort of an issue with TIF tarps, that TIFs are so retentive. You know, they're called totally impermeable. The fumigant really does not pass through them. It'd have to go kind of around them to get out eventually. So it retains the fumigant for a much longer time, which means that if you cut the tarp too early, there can still be a significant off-gassing event. So one of the mitigations might be to force the tarp to be left on the field longer. So next slide. And so here you just look at, this is another DPR prepared slide. In order to meet the either the 55 parts per billion or the 110 parts per billion standard, the buffer zones for some applications will have to be increased enormously to, you know, half a mile or more. But if you look down at the tip ones toward the bottom, buffer zones can still be relatively small based on the method. So next slide, please. Finally, the Neo-Nicotinoids. I had planned to do more on them, but they've been kind of shelved by DPR because of COVID-19 priorities. The concerns with neonicotinoids, both federally and and locally is that, you know, the very things that make neonicotinoids desirable, the fact that they have, they stick around and they're water soluble and can be distributed throughout plant systems and keep killing sucking insects for months after their application, are the same things that make them bad for the environment. There is concern that applications under some conditions will, and these have been demonstrated through research, that for a number of the neonicotinoids under certain uses, that using them at the highest allowable rate produces unacceptable levels of pollinator kills, and not just honeybees we're talking about. You know, solanaceous plants might be pollinated by bumblebees, and alfalfa by other kinds of bees, and squash by squash bees. So it's not just honeybees that we're trying to protect by making sure neonicotinoids are not improperly used. It's pollinators in general. And so there will be mitigations coming out that will probably involve the eliminating certain uses. You can't use it on certain crops, you know, that are attractive to pollinators, or further restricting times of year that it can be used on certain crops to avoid the bloom. So you can't use it on a crop if that's the blooming season for that crop. So things like that will come out, and they're talking about a regulatory package, but it could just be labels too. So expect that. I'm not sure when. Like I say, last I heard from DPR is this is not a front burner thing due to priorities with COVID-19. I have a minute or two while I'm at it. I'll just address a couple issues about COVID-19. There have been queries to DPR about whether there can be relaxed PPE requirements due to the difficulty in obtaining N95 masks and respirators, face shields, you know, the same sort of things that are PPE in the medical setting have become very scarce. But DPR's position, and we agree with that here at the Ag Commissioner, is we can't be relaxing those requirements because that would compromise worker safety. And so we need to maintain, you know, industrial hygiene and make sure workers are protected. We can't be sacrificing workers in order to meet the needs. So if a particular piece of PPE is required and you don't have that PPE, then you have to use an alternate pest control method. It's as simple as that. We are working on obtaining some masks. We have quite a few masks currently that are not pesticide PPE. They're surgical masks. We have hundreds of thousands of these, and they're available free of charge to growers for use by field workers for COVID-19 purposes. So if you have a harvesting crew or something to help protect them from the possibility of spreading the virus person to person, you can use these masks for that purpose. But we do not have currently pesticide PPE to distribute, but we're looking at seeing if we can obtain some pesticide PPE masks that can be used. So that's all that I had prepared. I'm finishing a little bit ahead of time, but that means if there are any questions, I guess now I'm available for questions.
Yep. Before we do that, we're going to launch your little quiz poll. So participants, if you're can see the screen, we're going to launch a poll. So Andy, can you take a look at the poll and address?
Okay, which of the following changes is proposed by DPR for field fumigation regulations? Some people put in the increased label emphasis on acute toxicity. That was regarding Paraquat. The correct answer was done by 71% of our group, the property operator is responsible for posting the field. Current regulations say that just say that the fields have to be posted in such and such way. The proposed change is that the property operator shall assure that fields are posted in such and such way. Which of the following is not a new requirement for Paraquat products? I guess my teaching skills were not great here. Only 46 got the correct answer that 72-hour notice of intent is not something that's required for Paraquat. Container will not pour, I talked about that. I talked about the online course, and I talked about use by certified applicators only, but more than half picked one of those three. And then, which of the following was a reason DPR further restricted the use of carbaryl? And you did pretty well on this. 3/4 of the people got the correct answer, that it was toddler exposure due to ingestion. 14% said bystander exposure during aerial applications. And I'm pretty sure I didn't say anything about that. So I guess maybe more pictures or something next time would bring it home better.
Great, thank you. We're going to take some Q&A now.
Okay.
All right, so the one question that we have is, currently, can a certified applicator supervise an application by a non-certified applicator?
This is for Paraquat, I assume?
I assume.
Currently, they can. We may impose that requirement by permit condition to everybody, but currently that's the state right now. So it could still be used, you know, and this gives everybody, there's kind of a, until this is a requirement, you know, the requirement now is that you have to follow the label. And if you have new label product, then that requirement is on the product. So you would have to do it, that requirement would be applied, what's the word? That requirement would apply if you have the new product. But if you have old product and old label, then that does not apply. That was a little garbled, but so it's not required for everybody right now. But once all the products are new label, then it will be required. And certainly by next year's permit renewal season, we will have that requirement. So by 2021, certainly everybody who wants to apply Paraquat will have to be a qualified applicator, certified applicator, and will have to pass the online course.
Okay, great. And then the one other question that we had was somewhat answered, but it was a question about an old school antidote for Paraquat poisoning is to eat clay. And does that still work, even though it would be difficult to swallow a pound of clay a day?
I don't know anything about that. So I heard hydroxychloroquine works great.
Great.
Just kidding.
And that's all the questions we had. So great timing.
Okay.
Well, we'll move on. The next presentation is an update from California Strawberry Commission. And I think if Dan Legard's around or somebody on his behalf, Joy would take it over.
Hey, good morning, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if this works. Okay, can everyone see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. I imagine most folks were really hopeful to come to a meeting where we didn't have to talk about COVID-19. So I'm sorry to burst everybody's bubble, and we almost want to consider this a regulatory as well as an update in terms of what the California strawberry industry is doing and how we're responding to COVID-19. What I think is very interesting is that Dr. Lagarde, who I think is on the line, has informed me that COVID-19 is the largest research effort in human history. So all around the world, all efforts have been diverted to COVID-19, as we're well aware, and that obviously has its effects in agriculture as well. From 3 months ago, we've seen a really steep evolution from really learning new things about COVID-19 and how that's translated very quickly to behavior change in all of our lives in across the world, and that ag is no exception to having to implement really steep behavior change very quickly. In early March, I was, on March 4th, I was at the Monterey County Ag Expo, and I was presenting to a group of 250 strawberry farmers. And we were talking about hand washing and sanitizer and no-touch greetings. A week later, our food safety classes were transitioned from what's normally 100 people in a class to 30-person classes, specifically addressing the basics of COVID-19 prevention. And then 1 week later, on March 16th, we saw the first shelter-in-place orders in the state. So it was very, very quick onset of from going from 250 person events to no events allowed, and that's had a real impact on our training and how we communicate with the industry. And I think we've all discovered new channels and new ways, including this meeting by Zoom. So I want to say thank you to UC Cooperative Extension for kicking the tires on this format and helping us to see new ways of reaching out and communicating with the industry. Okay. To advance. There we go. So early on, we recognized that worker health and safety was really the major issue that we needed to address. In those early days of March, we were implementing the cornerstone of our training program, which is our food safety program. And thankfully, the industry has been talking about hand washing, worker health and hygiene, and sanitation practices for food safety for decades now. And so thankfully we had a very good base to work from. And then we began to include the COVID specific basics. At that point in time, there was really very little information and valid information that was available in Spanish. I think we were all hit by the fire hose of information, but very little of that was translating over into the Spanish language channels. So early March, we created training pamphlets to start communicating with our field crews and our supervisors. Ventura, of course, at that time was in full swing in strawberry harvest. Santa Maria and Watsonville less so, but we were still getting ready for the harvest season to be coming in and really determining how we were going to talk to an audience regarding this emergency and this really urgent public health crisis that we were dealing with, that we had on our hands. So, you know, in the 3 months really since then, I think we've all seen the real deluge of federal and state and local orders and guidance on all fronts. And the Strawberry Commission really took on the task of distilling the flood of that information and how it applies to ranches and specifically targeting worker health and safety. So we have developed and continue to develop tools specific to the ranch that I'll talk about more. Here you see this was the first training poster that we created for training field folks. And as those tools were developed and we deployed them through our field outreach, we're very fortunate at the Strawberry Commission to have a robust staff that in research and in education that were our boots on the ground. And because we couldn't congregate folks to our training, we went out to the field and really scoured the ranches with information in the early days throughout March and throughout April. Our field staff covered 95% of the planted strawberry acreage across California. So I want to just recognize those staff members who were the boots on the ground in Ventura, Kevin Tate and Mark Edsel. In Santa Maria, we had Daniel Olivier, Miriam, I'm forgetting Miriam's last name, I apologize. Miriam and Jason Sherritt, and in Watsonville, Salinas, we had Ignacio Mendoza, Emily Webster, and myself. And of course, we were supported by Dr. Lagarde and our admin, Sophie Hernandez. So I really, it would not have been possible for us to reach as many growers as we were able to reach without that really robust effort that was put in early on in the crisis. Likewise, we started, pause on that for a sec. We recognized early on that, you know, that because Spanish language materials were not being developed, likewise, we understood that folks who speak indigenous languages were really not getting the message about prevention measures. And so we started creating the training pamphlets, ranch signage. We also started creating audio and video public service announcements that we found new channels to feed these audio and video spots into, including on social media, using radio, which we had not formally done previously. I started doing a weekly radio program in Ventura with Radio Indígena, specifically on a program called Agarra Semilla that is specific to addressing farm workers and farm worker needs. And we started doing some explainer pieces as well that I'll share shortly, some of those. So all of these tools are available on our website. And I'm going to go ahead and play our English public service announcement.
During the coronavirus pandemic, agricultural operations are essential for producing food for human consumption. While we continue to work on the ranch, cooler, processing plant, trucking routes, or supermarkets, we have the responsibility of keeping ourselves and our coworkers healthy. The coronavirus is mainly spread through close contact with the respiratory droplets of sick people, either through their cough or sneeze. For that reason, if you have or are caring for someone who has a fever, cough, or shortness of breath, you should stay home to recuperate and stay away from others while you are contagious. The best way to protect ourselves is the same way we would avoid a common cold. Stay home if you are sick or taking care of someone else who is sick. Wash your hands frequently with soap and water for 20 seconds. Do not touch your eyes, nose, or mouth with unwashed hands. Cough or sneeze into your elbow or into a tissue, which you must throw away in the garbage. Disinfect high contact surfaces such as bathroom door handles, chairs, picking carts, soap dispensers, and cell phones. Maintain 6 feet of distance from others, including during break times. With everyone's effort, we can keep ourselves, our coworkers, and our ranches healthy. Thank you. For the most updated information, please consult local public health officials and the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. This message brought to you by the California Strawberry Commission.
Okay. I need to shout out to Miriam Mendez. So for those of you who are in the Santa Maria area and San Luis Obispo, we have a new field research specialist, Miriam Mendez, and I apologize for getting her last name. So I want to shout out to her as well. Okay, so you'll see a question in the poll that says, in what languages are commission training materials for COVID-19 prevention available? This is not the poll, but you would be correct if you answer later that our materials are available in English, Spanish, and Mixtec. Mixtec is one of the largest indigenous languages spoken in the fields by farm workers, and there are many others that are spoken, but ours, we've focused a particular effort on creating Mixtec materials, and especially audio, for audio and video. So those early communication tools, you know, as we saw the guidance coming out, there really we're getting basic public health messages out, but there is more and more guidance that was coming out related to specifically related to agriculture and maintaining critical infrastructure and protecting essential workers. So, you know, we went from, I want to say, a public health message to moving into how to distill and implement procedures on the ranch. So the 3 standard operating procedures that we developed related to disinfecting high-touch surfaces. We're used in food safety. We're used to sanitizing food contact surfaces. This was specifically related to high-touch surfaces where where workers are in a shared environment, whether it's the bathroom doors or the paper towel dispenser or the picking carts or chairs. And so this was very specific to COVID. Obviously, social distancing is something we've all become aware of. And our latest standard operating procedure is how ranches can assess and respond to suspected COVID-19 infections at work. So including how to conduct screenings, as well as what to do if somebody does report that they're ill or that they're symptomatic. I have never seen in the amount of time that I've been with the Strawberry Commission, I've never seen any as much regulatory guidance as there was specifically around COVID, and between the federal guidance from the CDC and from the state guidance and the local guidance in the areas of public health, labor, occupational health and safety, and human resources, you know, and legal guidance. It really has been a flood of information, and we've tried to distill this down. So the visual that you see on the screen is really distilling things down to what what companies need to do on a daily basis. And all of these are available on our website. Okay. So what standard operating procedures has the Commission developed to respond to COVID-19 on the ranch? There's been all kinds of guidance out there, but the Commission specifically has worked on procedures for sanitizing high-touch surfaces, social distancing, and assessing and responding to suspected COVID-19 infection. So I hope you all get 100% in the poll later. I mentioned our SOPs. We now have translated those into explainer pieces, videos, posters, visuals that make it more digestible. And this is an animated explainer piece that we put together, specifically addressing the higher concentration of disinfectant solution that is required during COVID-19. So I'll play this, and special note that an answer to one of the questions is in this video. So tune in.
There are many disinfectants you can use. Always follow product label instructions and use all indicated personal protective equipment. Only those employees trained to handle pesticides should mix and apply disinfectant solutions. Bleach is one of the most commonly available disinfectants. The active ingredient in bleach is sodium hypochlorite, and you can make a solution out of any bleach that contains between 5.25 and 10% sodium hypochlorite. To make a disinfecting solution from bleach, first, put on protective gloves, protective clothing, face protection, and eye protection, such as safety glasses. Mix 1 ounce of bleach with 1 gallon of water. Use a test strip to confirm the concentration is between 500 parts per million and 1,000 parts per million. At this concentration, the solution may be corrosive to some metals and irritating to skin, eyes, and respiratory tissues. Only apply your bleach disinfectant in a well-ventilated area. To disinfect, spray or wipe disinfection solution to completely cover and wet the surface. Let the surface sit with disinfectant on it for at least 1 minute and until the disinfectant has dried. Ensure that no employees touch items until the disinfectant has dried. Keep in mind, active chlorine degrades over time and in the presence of air, light, heat, and organic matter. It is best to mix smaller quantities daily than to store large quantities that will become less effective over time. This message brought to you by the California Strawberry Commission.
Okay. So I want to mention about this animated video in particular. We collaborated with a group called Digital Nest out of Watsonville, which is a group of young adults later in high school, at community college, or after graduating from high school, they're part of a youth incubator, business incubator that does this type of digital media. And they are by and large sons and daughters of children of farm workers in the Watsonville area. So I highly recommend working with them. We're really pleased with how the product turned out. And this video, along with others, again, is available in Spanish and English on YouTube and on our website.
Okay, thank you.
Oops, let's see. And then the question will be, what concentration of sodium hypochlorite in water is recommended to disinfect surfaces of novel coronavirus? The correct answer is between 500 and 1,000 parts per million, or 1 ounce of 5 to 10% bleach to 1 gallon of water. So we're really learning and seeing how this is all being, implemented in the field. People implementing social distancing, disinfecting surfaces, using face coverings, and training is going to be a critical piece as we move forward into the harvesting up in northern districts. And we see people using really interesting techniques like the sneeze guard you can see here with the puncher, and people are making, agriculture is responding to this crisis and this public health effort. And for everyone who, you should go to our website, calstrawberry.com/coronavirus, and you'll find all of our materials there.
Okay, thank you, Joy. We'll move on with the program here. Our next talk is going back to fumigants and fumigant application. It's still going to be an important issue for us going forward, and we have Alex Putman, who's a UC Riverside plant pathologist specialist, who will give an update on this topic.
And while he's getting his presentations up, we're going to do one more poll, so everybody get ready to answer it real quick.
Okay, should I
Yeah, go ahead, real quick.
Okay, looks like good 92% got our SOP question right. For the 8% of folks that didn't, again, refer to our website, but yes, PPE face coverings and training are certainly in our bailiwick. It's just not the standard operating procedures. Good job, 81% got the proper concentration. For the other ones, you're gonna be doing a good job. For the 13% that gets between 200 and 500, you'll do a good job of sanitizing foodborne viruses that are foodborne. But for COVID, it's increased. And 94%, all of the above, very good. And for the others, check out our website, YouTube, Facebook for all the materials. Thank you.
Thanks again, Joy. So Alex will give an update with his talk now. Alex, you ready?
Yes. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending, and I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy. So the project I'm going to talk about this morning is a collaboration with a large group, and was originally spearheaded by Frank Martin at USDA in Salinas and Steve Fenimore with UC Davis, also located in Salinas. And this group includes plant pathologists, weed scientists, irrigation and nutrient specialists, economists, experts in imagery analysis or remote sensing, and a TriCal and a Food Origins are very important partners in this project. This project is funded by the California Department of Pesticide Regulation, and also I'd like to acknowledge the very important help and assistance of grower cooperators who were very accommodating to host our trials. Okay, so fumigation, of course, is often applied uniformly or evenly at the high label rate over a field when perceived risk from a pest is high. And so this applies to both the broadcast and drip fumigation. However, when we're talking about soil-borne diseases, they usually occur in clusters or hotspots in a given field. And so you can take this example here of a field. Here we have a kind of heat map of disease incidence, and it's overlaid on a satellite image of a field. And so, the redder it is, the more severe the percentage of death of plants. And so kind of there's one half of the field where kind of mortality is kind of high, and then there's an area where it's relatively low, and there's a hotspot of mortality here along the left end as well. And so with this project, kind of the main question is how to provide knowledge to growers about the spatial distribution of disease. And so we're doing that in a few different ways. The first is determining how much pathogen is in the soil by doing counts as assessed from soil samples. And then we do this because the amount of the pathogen in the soil is the biggest factor affecting disease severity. And then some other methods we're using, including mortality, as I mentioned, counting just what is the percentage of dead plants, and then also using some aerial imagery or remote sensing to assess plant health. And this is useful because, at least with respect to soil-borne diseases, because of course disease is likely to recur in the same area. The diseases we're talking about are soil-borne, so they depend on movement of the soil to move around, and so they can be moved by cultivation and anything done to the soil, but they're not may not move around that much. And then we're also interested in looking at yield at a high resolution, and so we're doing this to determine how a yield is influenced by these other factors, by plant health and pathogen levels in the soil. And so the idea with this project is how can we collect this information, integrate it to allow for improved management of strawberry. And one question we have in this particular project is, can this information be used to reduce overall fumigation rate in low disease pressure areas of the field without sacrificing yield? And so the kind of a general overview of the methods we're using. We have two treatments in this project. One is the standard broadcast or flat fumigation. And in precision treatment, what we do is we establish zones within the plot of variable rate fumigation and apply fumigant at a rate that's proportional to the pressure. So we can have high, medium, or low disease pressure, say, in a plot, and then we apply different rates of fumigant to the different zones plot. And the levels we're using here, the fumigant is trichlor, chlorpicrin, and we have 3 different rates for the variable rate fumigation of 250, 300, and 350 pounds per acre. And the standard was assigned the 350 pound per acre rate, the high rate. Most of the fields we're working with are about 10 acres in size, and the study was arranged with a randomized complete block with 3 or 4 replications. Okay, we have several locations for these trials. In the first year, we had a trial in Oxnard. It's a fall planting with a history of both Fusarium and Macrophyllina. 2 fields this cycle in Oxnard this year. One is a fall planting with a history of Fusarium wilt, and the next field is a summer planting with a recent history of Macrophyllina. And the 4th field was in Salinas Watsonville, 2018, excuse me, 2019. That was a fall planting with a history of Verticillium wilt. This is the general timeline for the project in a given study year. So at the end of the previous crop, so in June, late June, around that time, we go out and assess the situation in that crop. And for this first study year, we were counting the mortality, and then because we didn't have the aerial imagery available, and then after a termination and cultivation and working the soil, then the pathogen is quantified by taking soil samples, and then we use the mortality counts to come up with the fumigation, the variable rate fumigation zones. And then the fumigant was applied. And then following planting, the plan would be to take our aerial imagery at kind of regular intervals over the course of the season, and then take the yield data when harvest begins. Okay, so jumping right into the data here. Here's that heat map I showed earlier. Just going to explain it for a second. What we have here is each bed in the field is represented by a column or vertical line, and each bed was divided into 4 sections, each 85 feet long for accounting purposes. And so the mortality in this particular field ranges from a 0 all the way up to some parts of individual beds with around 50% mortality. And so from this mortality data here, I'm showing the fumigation treatments and the fumigation zones here in the bottom half of the figure. And so you know, the bottom half of the figure corresponds to the same plots in the top of the field. And so along the bottom, we've indicated the treatment, either the standard or precision, that was assigned to each plot. And then the color in each plot, each of those 6 boxes, indicates what the fumigation rate was. And so looking along the right side here, we have a couple standard plots, and here's another standard plot at the end. And so again, this is the high rate of fumigant, 350 pounds per acre of chlorpicrin. Then along the right, we have a precision plot. And again, we're looking at what the disease pressure is, in this case mortality, and then we're making a decision on what kind of rate of fumigant to apply. And since we had high mortality in this particular plot, we decided to uniformly apply the high rate of chlorpicrin, so it's not, it got essentially the same treatment as the standard plot next to it. But in these precision plots over here, you can see that the mortality is relatively low compared to the rest of the field. And so we set up kind of a lower rate zones here. So some areas of 250 pounds per acre, and then some areas of 300 pounds per acre. Whereas here in the standard plot, you have some areas that are low, but because there's a hot spot here that got the standard treatment anyway. Okay, so that study year here, we're looking at we've added the mortality counts at the end of the study year. So this is the previous year, the 2016-2017 season, and then this is the mortality at the end of the 2017-2018 season. And as you may remember, it's kind of a mild year overall. We didn't hear about much disease happening at the end of that season overall in Oxnard, and this was true in our particular field in our particular study field. And so we have some relatively small hotspots of mortality at either end of the field, kind of corresponding to what there was mortality in the previous year, but just overall much lower rate of it. Okay, now looking at the yield. And so just to set this up for a moment, what we have here is this was yield collected on an entire plot basis, and these plots are about 1.6 acres in size. And so this was data collected by the growers, a harvest crew, by simply marking off the plots and kind of collecting the yield for each plot at the end. And so here we've kind of broken up the display of the yield data per plot and in pairs of plots. So we have these 2 plots up here. One is standard and one is precision. So we're presenting that in this particular panel, and then the same for these other pairs of plots. And we did this because we saw some yield variation over the course of the field. And so basically what we're seeing here is the total yield on a 7-day moving total. So each, the line kind of tracks what the total yield is over the past 7 days. And basically what we're saying here is we're not seeing very much difference in yield for all the different pairs of the plots. Sometimes we can have a spike in one treatment and then a spike in the other treatment kind of later, which may reflect kind of how the harvest crew moves through the field on different days. But overall, we didn't see too much difference either at the critical, for price purposes, the critical early months, as well as when kind of overall yield totals start to increase later in the season. And just note, we don't have the full season's data, so we only have the data up to early May. Okay, now looking at the economic performance of this yield data in terms of the price that was available. And so to talk about this for a second, this is on a per plot basis. This is not adjusted to acre. And this is a partial budgeting analysis, which means these net returns are over only accounting for treatment costs. It doesn't account for any other, harvest costs or any other costs. So I apologize for presenting it this way. I should have done adjusted for total costs. So these kind of net returns make a little more sense. The precision treatment includes the pathogen sampling costs for sampling the soil and determining and quantifying the pathogen. And these were not the prices the grower received, but these were prices obtained from the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service. So basically what we have here is that the net returns when accounting for, which includes the amount of the fumigant applied, but also increased yield, is a slightly more net return in precision plots versus standard of about $2,500 or 6%. So to summarize this particular field, the first study year, we had 6% higher net returns for the first 4 months of the yield. And part of this is that in the precision treatments, due to those variable rates, 15% less fumigant was used in those treatment plots compared to standard. And just a few caveats, this was kind of a mild disease pressure year. The weather was a little mild. We didn't get severe heat towards the end of the season when we typically start seeing dieback. And this is not just true in this grower's field where we were hosted, but also generally in Oxnard. And also a few cerium-resistant cultivar was planted during the study season because this may have also mitigated disease pressure. So, so again, this is for this particular situation. Okay, so just a few words about the next study year in Watsonville. So this is a 10-acre field that was, we started in 2018, so it was on a strawberry veg rotation, and it was ending in strawberry in 2017. Verticillium wilt was diagnosed there, kind of low to moderate levels, and went into a couple of vegetable crops in 2018. And the second vegetable crop was, I believe, head lettuce, and it came down with a severe outbreak of verticillium wilt. And so in this particular case, due to that high disease incidence, we, in consultation with the grower decided they didn't want to do any reduced fumigation for obvious reasons. And so this kind of had a uniform application of chlorpicrin at 350. And so in this particular trial, we did a lot of work with remote sensing and soil sampling. So I'd just like to talk about that aerial imagery just a minute. And so what we have here is images of the field over about a monthly interval. And this is what's called a normalized difference vegetation index. Basically, it's sensing plant tissue and determining kind of how green it is in simple terms, and kind of as an analog or a way to see how healthy the plants are. And so this is a series of images over the growing season of 2019. And so once the crop really filled in kind of towards August, then you can, this is kind of just as the crop is filling in. And then later on, the canopy is filled in nicely, but we see here, there's some areas of lower density, of lower health here in the upper right part of the field. And so, so this is kind of some of the area where we saw some severe pathogen levels as well as some disease, although we don't have, I'm not going to present all that data right now, but I just wanted to point out another thing, that one of the capability that we have is tracking individual plants with this kind of analysis. So I just mentioned that this data was taken by a drone, a UAV. And so with this kind of data analysis, the data it's looking at is the NDVI, but it's kind of delimited or kind of picked out individual plants, and it's determining what the plant health is of each plant. And so they can be classified into healthy or unhealthy, or maybe dead or missing. And so what can be done with this is kind of stand in mortality counts, as well as tracking health over time with each image. So to summarize this project, we're trying to put together the system where we take different kinds of data. We're assessing kind of plant health, mortality, soil pathogen levels, and then determine what kind of treatment is appropriate. If it's the normal standard broadcast rate of fumigation, then that's appropriate. But if other things are appropriate, then that can be tested as well, excuse me. And then kind of monitoring this over the course of the season with aerial imagery, data collection. I didn't talk about yield data at all, but that's a very important part of it that we're really starting to come online with this studies this year. And then reassess kind of at the beginning of the next season. So what did we learn about the disease in the field? Was the treatment successful? And what are we going to make any adjustments to the treatment for next year? So this, the DPR part of this project is ending this year, but there's a part kind of expanded as part of funded by USDA, and that expanded project is headed by Frank Martin. So that's all I have. So let me unshare. I don't know. I'm going to check the Q&A. So I believe, Kelly, we don't have the poll from me, right?
That is correct. So we'll go straight into the Q&A.
Okay. So yeah, I'm looking at the questions here, and in your economic analysis, where you found 6% net return on precision fumigation, did you account for the cost of disease analysis, sampling, and mapping? Yes, the disease sampling was accounted for, and that was about a cost of about $40 per sample, and that included the labor of sampling and doing the analysis, as well as the materials with that. The mapping, I'm not sure if that was included, but that was kind of not a significant cost, and maybe just a little bit of time to put it in a map, and that can be made more efficient. So yes, those kind of disease analysis costs were accounted for in the precision. And just I'm skipping ahead here, there's a question about, I'm sorry if I missed it, but what was the grid sampling size? And you didn't miss it, and I apologize for not saying that, but that was over that 10-acre field, there were 66 samples taken, and so that's about 70 feet between sampling points, and each sample was about there were kind of several subsamples taken in a 10-foot diameter circle that were pooled together. Next question, did you find greater yields in areas that did not receive as much fumigant? That's a good question. And so in this first study year, the yield we were looking at was just at the whole plot level. So we didn't break it down by which fumigant rate was applied to a specific area. And we're hoping to be able to do that with this high resolution yield. And so we may be able to see that with one of the locations that we're studying this year. Okay, the next question. How do you do a variable rate fumigation with a pathogen like verticillium, where the threshold CFU or colony forming units are basically the level of pathogen? For plant mortality and stunting could be as low as 2 to 10 pathogen forming units per gram of soil. That's a very good question, and I think is very difficult to answer, because we can, of course, strawberry is very sensitive to verticillium, and so you know, if you just have a small change in the amount of verticillium, that could be hard to detect or assess by soil sampling, that could create a big change in the level of mortality. And so it would be very difficult. And so it may have to come up with a situation that if you detect verticillium at all, that warrants, the high rates, whereas you'd have to have no detection, or maybe it would just be a lower, be very difficult or more difficult to employ this if the grower is concerned about if we missed verticillium when doing the sampling. So yeah, that is a concern for verticillium. Thanks for the question, Kelly. Okay, Donald, I think is that it?
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Alex. We'll go ahead and move on. The next presentation before the break from Steve Fenimore, who is a UC weed specialist in Salinas. He's been working on Fumigant and Fumigant alternatives for a while, and he'll give us an update from the Central Coast. So Steve, take it away when you're ready.
So can you guys see the screen okay? Yes, no?
Yes.
Okay, so Alec, I think we need to start by talking about strategy, and I know that that's a thing that people think about all the time, but may not refer to it at it, because we need to start at the big picture. So what Alex just talked about is a strategy that's focused on making the most rational use of the fumigants, because our assumption is that, I mean, we started out this meeting talking about the regulations, that the regulations are increasingly going to be more and more strict. And I don't think the trend is going to be the other way. I don't know, I've not heard anybody predict that. And so what I'm going to be talking about here is, I'm going to talk about fruiting fields a little bit, but I'm mostly going to talk about nurseries. And nurseries, in the California nurseries, are using methyl bromide, which I'll give you the exact numbers. So, think about a strategy. So I guess I asked this question to the entire strawberry industry. What would you do? How would you deal with it? Or what's the plan, folks, if methyl bromide were no longer available in the nurseries? You got a vegetative crop. I know that's a very sensitive issue, but somebody's got to deal with that question. So what we're talking about here is mostly focused on producing plants for organic fruit producers. And by the way, just as a disclaimer, I'm doing this work because the industry is interested in this work. So let's go. So there are limits. I've been writing a lot about this. I'm late in my career, and I like thinking about the big pictures. And so the agricultural chemical industry, I started out my career in ag chem at ICI a number of years ago. And I've been with UC for almost 23 years now. And I've seen the agricultural chemical industry greatly reduce. And so what I think has changed for me is that I've become to realize how limited they are. And in dealing with California crops, I think that's something we get right in front of us. Strawberry is important. These are major crops on the central coast of California. But in terms of corn and soybeans, and from Syngenta or Corteva's point of view, or Bayer's, these are small markets, and they're very valuable crops. And there's high cost of development of fumigants. So if we want a new fumigant, we went through a whole series of those things. Remember methyl iodide or Midas? I heard that the company that developed that, which ended up not being able to take it to the market, lost over $25 million. So that's not exactly a positive incentive. And we started out again with this presentation on strict use regulations. Fumigants are heavily regulated. Any debate about that? Fumigants are unpopular with the general public, whereas organic, even my own daughters are have strong opinions about this, about the healthiness of organic food. Don't tell them I said that. So fumigants are not organic compliant. So if the rules changed and organic fruit producers had to use organically sourced plants, what would you guys do? So I'm going to talk about steaming. I work on steam because steam works. So the questions are mostly engineering. So it's an old method. It was first used in Germany in the 1880s and in the US in the 1890s in greenhouses. And around the world, there are people working on this. Obviously, there are places that a lot of people, mostly in Europe and in Asia, who think that this is this technology is worth investing money in, and that's what we're interested in looking at. In the U.S., there's been limited interest in field scheme. I mean, people have told me, you know, why are you working on this? It's not going to work, and I keep working on it because we keep making progress. So why is the U.S. different, maybe than Europe? Well, fumigants are still available. I find when I talk to Europeans, especially the younger ones, they don't really have any experience with fumigants. Steam applicators are not available. John Deere and Case don't make steam applicators. The scale of operations is much larger in the US than in Europe. So what has happened, and I mentioned that industry is supporting this. I was approached by some folks in the nursery industry, and they is creating a soil steaming association, and they've got a mission statement, and its initial focus is on nurseries, but you know, this could be of benefit, of course, to fruiting fields. There's a great interest among the flower growers, and so this is set up. They're setting up a nonprofit association to basically bring the parties together to introduce this technology to California strawberry industry. So these are the fumigants that you're using. You know, it's kind of a dark joke, but you know, the list of fumigants that we use is pretty short. And Andy talked about this already, but there's the DPR numbers. Chloropicrin is the dominant one for fruiting fields, of course, with 1,3-D. Second, and then metam-sodium. So methyl bromide shows up on the DPR strawberry numbers, but those are for the nurseries, and there's the numbers. It's actually more pounds of methyl bromide used. This is the last number I found on the DPR website from 2017, 816 pounds used. So it's one of the, I believe it is the major use of methyl bromide in the US, if not one of the larger uses in the world. So that's on about 3,500 acres. So we're talking about nurseries. You know what they look like. So the Strawberry Commission, I have been trying to keep this chart updated for their excellent surveys that they do on acreage. And so the top line is conventional. Yeah, I have a cursor. I hope you guys can see that. So there's the trend. You know, the stock market likes to use a 200-day moving average. So here's an 8-year trend of the conventional acreage on the top, now down to just slightly less than 30,000 acres. But look at the organic on the bottom, you know, going from 2,500 acres to about 42. And that's pretty, you know, it's still a smaller part of the industry, but it's an upward trend. So there is demand for organic, no question about it. So we gotta get with the program and accept that. Be cool, like my hippie dog. Why do we need steam in California? This is in your neighborhood, Oxnard. This is off of Rose Avenue and Central, with I believe a high school there. Valuable land around it that's more difficult to fumigate. So we got buffer zones, we got organic fields, we got stiff regulations, increasing regulations, we got complicated neighborhoods. So how do you do steaming? You know, it's relatively simple concept. It's cooking pathogens in the soil. So steam is just water vapor. It's used as a heat medium to transfer the heat to the soil. And so pathogens like, the reason it works is that the Pythium, Verticillium, Macrophromina are more susceptible to and especially nematodes, to being killed with steam than are the soil microorganisms. The same thing can be said for methyl bromide, that the pathogens are more susceptible than the beneficials. So that's how it works. But there's a fine line between good and bad. You get with heat, what you're doing is basically what Goldilocks did. So 100 and what Goldilocks's porridge that's 180 degrees is too hot. Her porridge that's 130 degrees Fahrenheit is too cold, and 158 is just right. 20 minutes, that's the dwell time. So it's a method of soil disinfestation, process that kills soil pests by cooking them. So the idea is 20 minutes at 158. So, you know, methyl bromide, you leave the tarp on for a few days, you remove the tarp. With steam, it's over in really a few minutes. You don't want to get too hot. You get too hot, you kill the nitrifiers, the nitrifying bacteria. Those are critical. There's a number of species. They convert ammonium to nitrate. That has been a historical problem in greenhouses, where people just turn on the heat and cook the soil. It's not a good situation. We have the technology that we're using. It's very easy to avoid this problem. It's also cheaper to avoid this problem because you're unnecessarily spending fuel. So if you kill the nitrifiers, you get ammonium toxicity. But with the technology we're looking at, it's not that difficult. If you don't heat the soil enough, the Verticillium, Macrophromina, and other pests are not killed. So I'm going to talk about some nursery work. I'm also going to talk about some fruit work. So a little bit of data here. We're comparing steam to methyl bromide. This is the rig. This was operated by this fellow. His name is Eddie Warner, better known as Eddie Boy, and we were visiting with Driscoll's. So his machine is one he built on his farm in Fulton, Alabama, and it costs, he made it all himself, and it was his idea and his motivation. So he came out, the operating costs, a little over $4,000. That's for fuel, labor, and machine. Transportation cost was pretty significant. The design of his machine did not reach as deep as we wanted him to. We wanted to get 14 inches. He barely made it below 10. It took about almost 14 hours per acre. So, but it did work. His name of his company is Southern Turf Nurseries. So we have a lot of experience with steam. I like steam with mustard seed meal because both mustard seed meal has a nice amount of nitrogen in it. It's 4%, but it also is a biofumigant, and steam is helps release the biofumigant. So you're getting a little bit a double activity. You're getting the steam activity. You're getting a little biofumigant kick. Some of the prettiest strawberries I've seen have been a result of that treatment. So we talked about the need for steam. So here's my outline. I talked about a couple of nursery trials we did, some results. I'll talk about one fruit field trial, and then I'm going to talk about some international technology that we hope to be testing this year. So at Lassen, we compared it to methyl bromide, which was custom applied, and very low weed densities in this field. There were no difference. There was no difference in the Pythium. We didn't introduce any pathogen samples because I was afraid to do that in a commercial nursery. And then here's the plant numbers. in terms of the number of daughter plants at harvest, and there was no statistical difference between those numbers. So this was a more, and that was at Lassen, that was a replicated trial, as was this trial at Sierra Cascade. And so there we had, working with Driscoll, Sierra Cascade, and Trical, they had 2 formulations of methyl bromide, a 45-55 and a 57-43, and then steam compared to that. So here's the weed densities. There was very little difference. The highest numerical number was with the 57-43. Verticillium was, most of the treatments worked very well. The nematodes, I didn't show the control. The nematodes were over 1,000 in the control, and so all the treatments worked there. And then here's the number of daughter plants, and there were no statistical differences there. We didn't check the daughter plants for pathogens. That was that is something that we are going to work on next as we continue this work. So this is a trial that we did at Salinas in a fruit field. These are weed samples and verticillium samples, and basically steam compared to chlorpicrin. The top line is the control, and basically steam worked basically the same as chlorpicrin fumigant. And the yield, steam and chlorpicrin were statistically no difference. So in nurseries and in fruit fields, those were all done by the Southern Turf, the big machine, which a number of people saw because it was as big as an aircraft carrier. It works. So we continue to see when we use pure steam, as the efficacy is about the same as the fumigants, even in the strawberry nurseries. So I'm going to move to talking about technology, overseas technology. This is a machine, this is a company from Norway, Soil Steam International in southern Norway. And I visited them. I've been over there a couple of times. This is their first machine, their first commercial scale machine. Excuse me. Treats 4 meters, so about 12 feet. So basically what they use, and I'll explain kind of a schematic, but this in the lower left here, these are vacuum tubes. And so I'll show you, I think, it better here. So what they've got behind the machine is a hood. And in that hood, they've got a vacuum. So down at about 12 inches deep, if they want to treat their 30 centimeter depth or 12 inches, they run these vacuum tubes. This is based on a Dutch technique called negative pressure steaming. The Dutch do it in greenhouses. They've been doing that for decades. What the Norwegians have done, they're doing it in the field while moving. So that's what makes this different and what makes it pretty exciting. So they basically suck the steam into the soil, to put it quite plainly. So this original machine, that they call it the Soil Prep 400 for the 4 meter, they burn about 534 gallons of diesel per acre. So it's more efficient. Eddie Boy's machine burned almost 900 gallons per acre. He used a big rototiller. So Dr. Koschnick in Germany checked the soil after Soil Prep treated some strawberry fields there, or prior planting there. And he got 98% weed control and 95% nematode control with that device. So the machine, this is a schematic. I'll show you an actual picture of it next. But what the machine is, it's basically a Simox French, very impressive steam generator mounted on tracks. And we're going to use propane because we're going to operate in California. The numbers so far, and we want to verify this, but looking at about 455 gallons of propane per acre, at about 6.7 hours per acre. And I'll show you. So this is what that Simox generator looks like. It's on steel tracks. This is the machine that's coming to California in August. This is a look at the hood. It's folded up in this picture. This is folded down on top of the ground to create the vacuum. So this is 455 gallons of propane, a little bit about the money and the time. Everybody wants to know what's it going to cost, how long is it going to take. So somewhere between 3.4 and 6.7 hours. Those are the initial estimates. If you go use the slower number, the 6.7, that you can, if you run 18 hours, that's 1,100 gallons of propane a day. And so the estimated cost per acre, the actual cost, machine, fuel, and labor is about $1,400. And this is by far the cheapest that I've ever seen with steam, and actually the fastest. Another international machine that we're interested in testing, and I've just exchanged some emails with the South Koreans, and this is a commercial machine. This is not a prototype. There it is. It's called Steamy, and a company in South Korea called Misung, or they just go by JSE. This machine is set up for high tunnels. It's not as fast as we'd like, but we want to test their technology. This is a 2-meter machine, so a little 6.5 feet. It does 4/10 of an acre in about 10 hours. So it's slower than we would like, but it's not made for the field skied. But we want to see the technology, and they want to see the markets. So our plans: soil steam will be delivered to California in August. It has Soil Steam has set up a California subsidiary. So they're very serious about operating here. The JSE, they call it the Steamy, will be delivered to California in July or August. And there's a lot of other potential crops, flowers, golf course renovation, vegetable crops. And this is a machine that I have here in Salinas. This is basically a machine that Mark Siemens with the University of Arizona built down in Yuma. And we're collaborating, and we're doing this in lettuce especially for fusarium control down in the desert, but here for weed control and sclerotinia control here in Salinas Valley. So kind of to summarize and bring this baby home, let you guys take a break. Steam, we have a significant amount of data showing that it controls pathogen in weeds, and there's decades of experience with that. Plant and fruit yields with steam are equivalent to fumigants, and there is interest. I've talked to many of the nurseries, and they're asking for this. They started this request. So, and there's interest in the organic organizations are quite interested in being able to produce strawberry plants without fumigants. So thanks a lot to all the support, and that should take care of it. So.
Yeah, great. We're gonna launch the poll real quick. So participants, if you could, before we take a break, just answer these questions real quick. It should be up on your screen.
So Steve, the question is, how many of these machines do the nurseries need to treat their 3,000 plus acres?
Yeah, I've asked the nursery people that, and they claim they have a much bigger window. So, you know, how many of these machines do we need? I mean, people I'm talking to, they basically want their own machine. They like to keep things in their own control. So I don't have an exact number. Yeah, it's going to take a lot of hours, but I'll refer you to the nursery guys. They you know, do you treat all of the fields? Do you expect to treat all of the fields right off the bat? I view this as more of an incremental. You know, you learn how to fly, and then you talk about how many airplanes you need. So yeah, it's, you know, you can't just jump to treating the entire area. So, but honestly, I've heard people say there's several months they could be in the field treating. So it's not quite as intense as the season. So yeah, but yeah, it's not. I didn't say this was easy. So yeah, you know, the proper dwell time is 20 minutes at 158 or 70 C. And you maintain that by moving, and you set up a trajectory, and so the soil, once you get it hot, it stays hot, and literally you heat this. What I found, we can heat the soil up in just a few minutes. So yeah, what do you do if you kill the nitrifiers? You know, you've spent money unnecessarily on fuel. You should have been going faster, and that's how we control it, is simply with speed. We go faster if we're getting the soil too hot. And so we're going to treat more area. But yeah, I did not say this was easy, but we have to be prepared for the possibility, and we also have to meet the needs of the organic industry. So that's what I got. Anything? So plants. Okay, the plants grown after steaming are really beautiful. Okay, yeah.
Thank you, Steve.
Yep.
So I think we're going to take a quick 5-minute break. We're running a little bit behind, so we're going to shorten the break. Let's come back at about 10:35. So that's a 7-minute break. We'll start right at 10:35.
So Ben Faber will give us a quick update about the Healthy Soils program and what it means for our growers and our land. So, Ben?
I've got to unmute. Now you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So we're going to be talking about the Healthy Soils program. This is a program that's been funded by the California Department of Food and Agriculture. And we're not moving ahead.
Ben, you might need to click back on that screen to be able to use the arrows.
I might need to do what? Okay, so the California Climate Smart Agriculture is a program that's throughout the state. It's money that is been generated through the Air Resources Control Board, and it's a program to increase the amount of carbon that's stored in the soil. And so it's done through 3 separate programs: alternative manure management, which we don't really have much to do with here in Ventura and Santa Barbara counties. The SWEEP program, which was a program that was improving irrigation efficiency, and then the Healthy Soils program. So these funds were basically designed to sequester carbon, decrease greenhouse gas emissions, and improve soil health. And so by improving soil organic matter, this is going to lead to reduced greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a whole lot of discussion about what exactly soil health is and what soil quality is. And soil health is basically gaining attention because it's in theory promotes agricultural practices that are not only good for the soil, but also good for farmers and ranchers and the environment. So these terms of soil health and soil quality are kind of interchangeable. So the practices that are pertinent to vegetable and berry growers in this area would be cover cropping, use of composts, reduced tillage, hedgerow plantings, windbreak establishment, field borders, field strips, nutrient management improvement, and grassed waterways. So these are all practices that would be funded to be used on farm. So there's basically 2 different phases of this, what are called the incentive grants. And these are directly to a grower to adopt a program, something like cover cropping. It actually pays growers to adopt these practices, such as using mulches. And these are basically practices that have been shown by Natural Resources Conservation Service to be effective, and the reimbursement rates are those that have been established by NRCS. Anyone who's involved with one of these incentive grants agrees to have soil data collected on their farm, and these practices should be new to that grower. The second form of funding is soil demonstration grants, and so these were much larger grants, as much as $250,000, where growers would adopt a practice and then permit people to come on farm to see how those practices are working, or if they're not working as well. In some cases, cover cropping is not the best practice to adopt in some circumstances, and the idea is to see where these practices are effective or not. So there are a whole lot of, these are grant programs from the state, and there's a lot of exclusions involved, which is kind of typical of state grants. The primary requirements for being involved in a program is you have to show historical cropping practices, what's been done in the field, and what's being proposed to be done. You have to have this plan reviewed by CDFA, and it goes through a comment calculator, which is a way of calculating greenhouse gas emissions that would be associated with adopting this practice or not. The selected projects are subject to review by CDFA, and the practices have to be verified to having been adopted. So if you get this money, you're supposed to do something with it. So all the projects that are submitted are subjected to a scoring process, and this is kind of how the projects have broken down in the last several years. And this program started up in January of 2017, and there's very little chance to get the word out, and there were only 67 applicants, most of which of the programs were funded. There was a total of almost $2 million. There's a lot of money involved in these programs. And then the next year of 2018-19, there were 222 applicants, and 194 of those applicants were awarded. So you can see some of the money that's involved. Nearly $10 million was awarded last year. And the goal was reduction of 26 metric ton equivalents of CO2 that were going to be sequestered. This is what happened this last year. This is broken down by county, and you can see, the big counties like Fresno got most of the money. Ventura and Santa Barbara down here. There were only 5 and 6 applicants, but it's a pretty good success rate for the applicants. This is what's happened this year. There was close to $28 million available to be awarded, and most of that was given out as of May 15th. So it was supposed to be continued through June, but all the money was basically given out by last month, or by May 15th. So here's an example of what a Healthy Soils grant could be used for. The Healthy Soils covers cover cropping, and it's basically anything that covers the ground. So grasses, legumes, forbs, and annuals, and then there's some sort of a killing process. And this is how cover crops could be used. And, of the 2 programs that were funded here, both of which were used in citrus orchards. These were cover crops planted in between rows, and then there was a another project that was used for a mulch in between broccoli. And so one of the ideas behind cover crops is that, you know, you're introducing something that has multiple impacts on the land. So it reduces erosion, it can suppress nematodes, suppress weeds, and so on. And so one of the funded projects was done by Ole Bocci down at South Coast Field Station, where they looked at a summer cowpea or marigold cover crop, and then a fallow that they compared it to, and they looked at the broccoli crops that were harvested off that field over the years, and it shows here what had happened to the organic matter in the soil after putting out these cover crops. And so the cover organic matter does increase. And what was more important to the grower in this case is what impact it would have on broccoli subsequent in its planting. And in both cases, both marigolds and cowpeas increased the productivity of the broccoli. So, you know, it's a win-win situation in this case, where a grower is going to improve the soil health as well as improve productivity. So there are technical advisors, one of whom is in this county, but throughout the state, there's 10 what we call climate smart members, and they can be contacted through this website. And we also have at the Resource Conservation District, Jamie Whiteford, that is spearheading this. So that is the Climate Smart program for berries and vegetables. Any questions?
Before questions, let's launch that quick poll. It's one question. If you guys can see it, please go ahead and vote. Give you about a minute.
All right, very good.
Great, and we don't have any questions, but if some come up afterwards, we can ask them at the end of the meeting. I think we can go ahead and move on to the next presentation.
Okay, thank you.
We'll continue this healthy soil conversation, and we'll be talking about adding carbon to the soil, one of the climate smart approved techniques. If you're a first time user, you can get grant money for this. But we'll hear overview one of the leaders in technology, Joji Muramura, UC Santa Cruz, and recently of UC ANR. And he'll talk about the progress in this technology. So Joji.
All right. Can everybody see this slide? Can you hear me? All right. Good still morning, everybody. Let's see, I'm going to talk about a little bit of update of ASD, anaerobic soil disinfestation research, but mostly cover the basics, and then a little bit of an update towards the end. And then Oleg's going to talk about a new research in Oxnard area. Okay. So ASD, many of you have known already, but developed in the Netherlands and Japan independently around year 2000, the biological alternative for fumigation. And the picture shows the Dutch method on the top, and then Japanese method at the bottom. The principle is acid fermentation in anaerobic soil. And we've been working on this approach to optimize for California strawberries since 2003. And then came up with the standard approach using rice bran from Northern California, usually 6 to 9 tons per acre. That rate is the temperature dependent. The warmer the temperature, the less the carbon source you need. And then incorporate bran, usually thin or chiseling, and list the beds covered with plastic mulch. That's the standard practice for strawberry. And then drip irrigate total 1 to 2 acre inches over 3 weeks period. And then leave for 3 weeks for fermentation treatment under the topped covered bed soil. And the temperature, water, and the carbon source type and rate are the 3 important variables to determine that determines the level of anaerobic condition or fermentation process that take place. And during the fermentation process, byproducts such as organic acids, volatiles, or microbial community shift, or a production of toxic ions such as Fe2+ or manganese 2+, all works for controlling pathogens. And ASD, when you do autumn, fall, when temperature is relatively low, that's a typical time to do soil preparation for fall planting. It works well for controlling Vertidium. But that's not the case for Macrophyma and Fusarium. And Macrophyma, so far results are kind of mixed. Sometimes works control well and sometimes not. So we need more study. But Fusarium, we have a lot of experiences. And this is very important to know that if you do autumn ASD for Fusarium field, you can make the disease worse. Fusarium is known as saprophyte, which means can infect not only living organism, but also can use dead organisms like rice bran. Well, actually, they love rice bran, so they feed on it, and then Fusarium disease can get worse. So to control that by ASD, you have to do ASD in the summer. Here's some picture of experiment highly infested by Fusarium. Left side is untreated control, plants are dying. And if you do fall ASD, more plants are dying. It's worse. But if you do summer, it's much better. And we found the threshold is about more than 460 hours above 80-60 Fahrenheit at 8 inches soil depth. If you clear those kind of conditions, you can control Fusarium by ASD. Well, but in a coastal area, how can we reach that temperature even during the summer? That's a good question. And then this is how we did it. We basically did in this case, we use a cover crop as a partial carbon source, but mixed with rice bran and incorporate it and put the drip tapes and clear plastic mulch, in this case TIF, simultaneously, and then irrigated water and did ASD during the summer. So summer flat ASD with clear TIF in this case. That's a necessary method to control Fusarium, which is more expensive than regular ASD. But so we are still working on how we can control Fusarium under lower temperature by changing ASD approach. But that study is ongoing. And you did mention the cover crop. So the cost of rice bran is increasing. So how can we reduce the cost? So we tried a summer cover crop to partially replace the rice bran. And those are example of cover crops we tried in Watsonville area. Sudan grass, Merced rye, triticale, and wheat, Summit 515. Those can produce 3 to 4 tons per acre of dry biomass. So with that, we can subtract those amounts from 9 tons. So mow those cover crops and apply like 5 tons of rice bran. That works as well. And Oleg's gonna show some data from Oxnard area experiment using cover crop. And this is the Strawberry Commission's from the Strawberry Commission website. It's about the resistant variety. It's not ASD, but especially for organic growers, it's very important to combine different tactics, and the resistant variety is one of them. And unfortunately, there's no single variety that are resistant for all pathogens. But look at this, Fusarium, greener color means more resistant. We have multiple choices in Fusarium varieties. So that's important information. And one of the new experiments, we did 8-year organic rotation trial at UCSC farm, where Vertidium diarrhea was a major pathogen. And then we compared first different rotation period, 1-year break, 2-year rotation, or 3-year break, 4-year rotation. And within which we have broccoli-based rotation or lettuce-based rotation. Broccoli, as you know, can suppress Vertidium population in the soil by incorporating residues. And lettuce, on the other hand, has a host of Vertidium, but it's more lucrative crop than broccoli. So we had both. And then within each rotation, we have 4 different treatment, bare farrow, mustard cake, or ASD plus compost. So in terms of effective rotational lengths, there was no statistically significant difference, but numerically, 4-year rotation, 3-year break had 20% more yield than a 1-year break. But that's not the case when you have a broccoli as a rotational crop. Almost a similar yield between those different rotational period. And interestingly, mustard cake and ASD has no difference in this case. But that's not the case for lettuce rotation. Lettuce being host of Persium, effective ASD was significant compared to mustard cake. ASD, so this tells us ASD can be a good tool for growers, strawberry growers, when they have no choice but to plant strawberries after host crops such as lettuce, tomatoes, or peppers. Okay, with that, I'd like to thank all the fundings for the research, USDA and California Strawberry Commission, and collaborators, especially on the Department of Environmental Studies, Carol Shannon and Margareta Zavara. Okay, that's it.
So I believe there's a poll that we're going to launch for yours.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, if you see it on your screen, go ahead and vote.
All right. So the first question, to control fusarium wilt in strawberries by ASD in coastal California, the treatment must be done in the fall using black plastic mulch. This is false. Again, it has to be done during the summer using clear plastic mulch. And the second one, there are a couple of UC strawberry variety that are resistant to fusarium wilt, Persian wilt, and Macrophylla chacora. It is false. There's no single variety that are resistant to all three. Okay, thank you.
All right.
Oh, one question here. Wasn't ethanol used in ASD? Why it's not used anymore? Well, it's been used in Japan even today, but here it's very cost prohibitive. And then in Japan, they use in the like a benchtop greenhouse system or so forth. So the easy to use liquid material. Hope that answered the question. Okay, Oleg, take it away.
All right, thank you, Georgie.
Perfect.
So, ISD has been around here for a while, and one of the main problems was it was getting expensive because the main component is rice bran was getting more expensive every year. So lately we've been looking at what can we use instead of rice bran in ASD and still be effective. So a couple of things this year, we looked at substituting part of the carbon from the rice bran with a cover crop grown on-site. So instead of bringing a material from somewhere else, grow carbon on-site, and I'll talk about it later. But first, we wanted to test something more local here. Instead of being a rice bran from Fresno, we sourced mids or middlings. We also called mill feed, which is a byproduct of flour milling from San Bernardino for a small-scale research test. And apparently it's cheaper, and the transportation costs would be lower compared to rice bran, so that was of interest to us. When we looked at the rate similar to rice bran, which we use at 9 tons per acre, we use the same rate for mids. I call them mids from now on. The product from the milling, mixed with soil, just like rice bran. Everything was on the same way as with the rice bran. Irrigated, and about a week later, we planted strawberry. And that was compared to the beds we've been fumigated a year and a half prior to that in states without a crop. So it wasn't exactly a pre-plant fumigation, but those were fumigated soil beds that served as a standard. Now, in that study, we didn't look at anaerobic conditions and didn't measure them, but we could certainly smell them. And it smelled a lot like rice bran during ASD, so we're confident that it was happening. And the other important component, of course, is nitrogen, and of course, other elements as well that we expect from those brands and mids. And so on this chart, we have comparing fumigated soil and the mids ASD with 9 tons of product per acre. And with a pre-plant fertilizer of 300 pounds per acre, I think it was 16 or something like that. Basically, when we take soil analysis and we look at nitrate, which is pretty essential for plant establishment and growth from get-go here in Oxnard, we have sufficiency rate in both. We have higher rate of nitrogen available nitrate form after planting with a standard fertilizer, which is expected. It's designed to provide nitrogen quickly, but there's a fair amount of in the mids ASD as well. Just last week, actually earlier this week, I took samples again, and there's still nitrogen in both systems. And in fact, in mids, there's slightly more nitrogen available in the mid system. They're both in the optimum range still, which is very encouraging. We know that it provides us the nitrogen that we need in organic systems. In fact, mids provide, as you would see on the second and third parts of this table, a lot more phosphorus and potassium that we even need for the strawberry production. Now, those plants grew a little slower. It was on Santa Paula. We had cold nights. It was a little bit behind the standard curve. But nevertheless, we have all the sufficiency ranges met with those materials, as with fumigated soil. I think equally encouraging is the fact that the three varieties we looked at, Petaluma, Warrior, and Victor, they all had the same trend: slightly greater yield for fresh market in mids compared to fumigated soil, which is really good for what we expect. And of course, Warrior yields were similar to Victor and more so than of Petaluma, which is expected for those varieties, are all 3 short day varieties. But that looks pretty good right now. This is the data from just about a week ago we compiled. And if you look at plants early, had no deficiencies, they all look pretty good. And the second part, we're looking at growing a cover crop. As Georgia alluded, it's a lot cheaper than bringing carbon from somewhere else. If you have time, you have water, the seed and seeding is very inexpensive and simple to do. So we looked at rye cover crop and barley cover crop, 2 scenarios. And in about the time we had, with low nitrogen left after previous strawberry season in the organic field, we're able to grow about 3 tons of biomass in both of those crops. That means we could decrease the amount of rice bran from 9 tons to 6, relying on the carbon brought by those cover crops during their growth cycle. It was tricky to accommodate the schedules, but it's possible to get done with enough planning, hopefully. This is how it looked. It looks like a mess of cake mix of bran and stubble and dry biomass, but it all became a carbon sources for the ASD process in the next 2 weeks. And ASD worked pretty well, regardless of treatment. Whether we had just rice bran without cover crop or barley or rye, they had good aerobic conditions. This chart shows you we reached this 50,000 threshold we'd like to get to within 2 weeks, and probably got some extra on top of this. So we're not losing anything so far. As far as nitrogen, we sampled just immediately after ASD. A lot of it was still in ammonium form, in reduced form of nitrogen, which would be required to get oxidized to get to nitrate. But we have no differences between the 3 treatments. Bran itself or Bran supplemented at lower rate with the rye or barley cover crop held about the same levels of nitrate, nitrogen, and ammonium nitrogen. This is data from nitrogen from last week. They still look comparable. They used up a lot. Strawberries grew very well in that field and produced really well. There's maybe slightly more nitrogen with rice bran with barley. I'm not sure why. But it kind of translated into this next graph of yield data that's showing us no differences, maybe very slight, non-significant difference improvement with rice bran and barley, maybe because we happen to have just a little bit more nitrogen in that treatment for whatever reason. But it looked very encouraging, and it tells you that we didn't lose anything by taking away the expensive fraction of rice bran and planting cover crops. Well, if you look at the plants that grew well in all treatments, but you can't really see the differences. One way you can tell the difference between the treatments was finding this volunteer crops. We actually had to build extra time, and some of the cover crops went to seeding. So in addition to other weeds, we'll see some nice rye and barley volunteering in those beds, so you know exactly what treatments were laid out. I would like to thank Solimar Farm and Hansen Rec and NIFA Funding and Arden Mills for providing the materials for these experiments, and kind of proceed to questions at this time.
Okay, so we have a question. Could silage corn be a good source?
It all depends. Corn, as you can be a good source. It depends on the carbon nitrogen ratio. And I'm pretty certain you cannot get away with a really high carbon and low nitrogen situation. So depending on the ratio, you'll have to still augment it with something high nitrogen like rice bran or wheat bran or something like this. So it really depends what you're getting out of your product. So this is about Fusarium in particular. You know, when we started looking at this for about 15 years ago, we knew right away the differences in variety susceptibility. This is an old picture of Ventana versus Camarosa. Back in the day, they were very different. And going back to today's time, the big differences as well. And we knew we had to look more at this as we go forward. In general, you know, our ability to produce fruit in presence of those pathogens, especially Fusarium, depends on those bullet points that I think you're all familiar with. Cultivar resistance, which is a key, doesn't control the disease, but it allows us to produce fruit. Fumigation optimization, Alex talked about being as precise as possible, fumigation, and as efficient as possible. Environmental conditions such as cool soils allow us to produce strawberries in the presence of disease, even if it's still in the soil. We talked about non-fumigant approaches, ASD, steam solarization, and such. And crop rotations, Georgie mentioned that as well. And of course, hydroponics or soilless culture exclude the pathogen altogether. And you know, one of the things that Alex also mentioned in his talk about sampling soil, sampling plants, doing a lot of data. And if you sample soil, you're going to have some numbers that you have to interpret and do something about. So we wanted to see what those numbers will do for our varieties. And in the studies, it's the second year we're doing this. We looked at the soil that had been fumigated and basically ready to go. And holes were cut. We'll excavate the soil from those holes, planting holes of certain volume with a tool, and mix it to a certain proportion with the sand, either pure sand with no inoculum or inoculated with a pathogen, in this case Fusarium, Oxysporum, Porus specialis fragaria, to different levels. The idea was to see how varieties respond to the increasing level of pathogen in the planting hole. This is last year's data. We looked at the growth. On the bottom, we see from 0 to 4, 0 being no pathogen, to 4 highest level of pathogen, inoculum level, the response in the plant canopy size. And in that case, we had Victor, Monterey, and Albion. Albion was most susceptible, Monterey being moderately susceptible, and Victor was supposed to be resistant. And it certainly looks like that there was no effect on the Victor plant size early in the season. And there's some images of this that really shows plants with not a whole lot of difference between the 0 to 4, between clean soil and heavily diseased soil early in the season. We don't really see disease early in the season, especially in Santa Paula with the cooler soils and slower growth. And when they looked at yields, there are two messages about this information. Is varieties like Victor that are resistant at 0 with no pathogen produce the same level of marketable fruit as at the highest level of pathogen, which is really encouraging. And for the varieties that are susceptible, such as Albion and Monterey, we didn't really see a dramatic reduction in yield until we get level 3, which is not the highest, but one of the higher inoculums. And by 4, we see a dramatic drop. So they can tolerate some level of pathogens. And we're working on this data to create this disease response curves. This is some visuals from the susceptible Albion from last year. At 0, no inoculum, it looked good. As you move to level 1, which is low levels, you start seeing partial crown decline. And level 2 gets a full crown decline, and 3 and 4, pretty massive dieback. So the summary of mortality, which is another part of the story, tells us that susceptible variety like Albion will reach near 100% mortality. And it's a pretty gradual decline from level 0 to 4. It's almost a straight line going up towards 100. Monterey is kind of intermediate position. As levels of pathogen in a root zone increase, it goes up, but it doesn't 100% die. There's some plants that survive better than Albion. And of course, on the bottom of this graph, with no decline, 0 mortality is Victor, which is truly resistant. Another way to look at it is we took soil samples in season in June and July, and concentration of what we call CFU, coliform forming units of the pathogen, as opposed to mortality. And there's a pretty good relationship for levels 1 and level 3. And for some reason for level 4, as in July we had less less pathogen in the soil, maybe more what was in the plant, in the vascular tissue by that time, I'm not quite sure, but that was the case. And that was also the case for Monterey. We see gradual increase in mortality with time and temperature of soil increasing from June to July. But as far as pathogen presence in soil, it wasn't following quite the same trend. But in general, for those two more susceptible varieties, which we do still have in California, from both UC and other breeding programs, we do have varieties that work pretty well in clean soils. But if you do increase levels from 0, which they would do really well, to 3 and 4, you have this gradual increase in mortality and see a few pathogen presence in the soil under the roots. So this year we looked at short day cultivars, Petaluma, Victor, and Warrior. Petaluma is supposed to be susceptible, at least partially, and I already talked about Victor and Warrior being resistant. Interestingly, early in the season, Petaluma had largest plants, larger than Victor and Warrior, so it grew really well initially. But as the roots grew and time went by and soils warmed up gradually, we started to see a little bit of differences. Early on, all the plants look fine. At Petaluma, all levels look fine. Same as for Warrior, Victor, and the same as for Warrior. We couldn't see a lot of differences yet. Just about 2 weeks ago, we saw a first decline and dieback in Petaluma. Nothing for Warrior and Victor yet. And so if you look at early production, I guess what we're seeing, there's no differences in yield so far. We're expecting yield for Petaluma to start going down, and Victor and Warrior is holding steady as we see in the previous years. So that's where we're at with this study. And I'll give you an update in later meetings, but I'd like to acknowledge UC breeding program for providing us with cultivars, and hopefully all other breeding programs have cultivars that do equally well or better. And the nurseries from Cedar Point and Lassen that's help us grow plants, and Hansen Rec and UCC staff and NIFA funding for supporting this work. I think that concludes the update on that study.
Great. We have a poll to launch, so everybody be ready. Go ahead. It should be just popping up on your screen. Go ahead and answer the questions.
All right. Looks like everybody's on the same page. We had pretty good efficacy with cover crop plus reduced rice bran. So we didn't really lose anything, and we did certainly get some nitrogen from those mids and mill feed that we sourced from San Bernardino. So we can continue this work, and I'll bring you some updates. But to continue on the subject, we'll hear an update from Cal Poly Strawberry Center. And Shashika and Gerald put this presentation together, and will give us a look at not just nitrogen and anaerobic conditions, but also microbiome in response to soil fumigation. So take it away.
Real quick before that, there was one question. How many plants per plot?
The question was for the mid study, we only had 12 plants per plot. For the cover crop study, we had almost a 9-acre large-scale experiment in Ventura, thanks to Solimar Farms for hosting us in their organic field. So those are large-scale plots. And the yield was taken from 20 plants per plot.
Great, thank you.
Gerald, Shashika, go ahead.
All right. Can you see me and hear me?
Yes.
All right, very good. Good morning, everyone. Sorry we couldn't be together in person. I missed the opportunity to interact with everybody, and right about now, I'd be salivating over the lunch coming up, right? Always a delicious lunch. I'm gonna share my screen. Shashika and I are going to split this presentation in half, and I'll take the first half, and Shashika will take the second half. Let's see, that's supposed to be full screen. There we go. Okay, so we have a project that we're looking at the changes in the soil microbiome in response to soil fumigation, and then we'll also give an update on disease diagnosis. The soil microbiome, we're talking about the area around the roots and even where there aren't roots, but the microbes, the microorganisms that live in and around that environment. And it's a very diverse group of organisms that reside there. there's fungi, there's bacteria, there's nematodes, and they're in vast diversity and array. And we think about the soil microbiome in terms of pathogens more typically, but there are a lot of other things there. And we know that soil fumigation, of course, affects that microbiome in a very dramatic way because it affects the pathogens, but it also will affect other microbes. And so this study is designed to look at the changes over time. Our objectives really, like I said, were to look at changes in the soil microbiome over time. We're really great to have Shashika on our team because she brings this expertise with her from her PhD work at Washington State University. And the idea is that maybe some of those organisms that are identified in the microbiome could be used to manage soil-borne diseases. Along the way, we measured, and this is really what I'll be talking about today because we don't have the full story, about the big question there is about the microbiome, and that data is not in yet. We were hoping to have more in by this time, but Shashika will fill you in on that. But today we'll talk about inoculum levels in the field where we did the work, the plant mortality that was measured, and the yield that was measured. And the microbiome data will be forthcoming very quickly. We did get a first slug of data back just this week, but we're unable to actually analyze it. So these are the treatments that we used. We had, in addition to the non-fumigated, we had 4 fumigants: chloropicrin, Kpam, or potassium methyl dithylcarbamate, Dominus, or AITC in its purest form at 96%, and then a combination of chloropicrin and AITC. This is the field where we did the work. We used cultivar Portola because it's highly susceptible to verticillium wilt, and all of these soils at Cal Poly are highly infested with verticillium dahliae. You can see here the soil type for these fields is really somewhere in between a clay loam and a pure clay. So they're very difficult to work, and you can see how lumpy the beds are. Over here on the right are the treatments, and we did this in large strips. These are about, each one of these blocks is about 150 feet long, and the beds are typical 4-row beds, 64-inch spacing. And so we've got 6 replications of this. We wanted, so whenever you're working with soil-borne diseases, pathogens, the variability can be quite high, and so we wanted to replicate it 6 times. 4 would be normal, so this would a little higher replication. Just to give you a sense of the timeline, this spans the summer. It's a summer planting, and that happened in June of last year, and then July was, I'm sorry, the fumigation was in June and the planting was in July. We took a couple of yields before it was getting too cold, and then mowed the crop down and let it come back, took another couple of yield measurements, and then tried to stress it for moisture so that we could see a greater amount of mortality. And this crop was just disked in maybe 2 weeks ago. On the bottom of this timeline, you see the soil sampling dates. We actually took 6 different timings, 1 right before the fumigation, 1 right after the fumigation, but immediately prior to planting, as soon as we could get in, essentially, to sample the beds, and then at different stages during the crop development, and then 1 at the very, very end. Okay, so this is transplanting in July last year. Again, telling you just how heavy the soils are here. It's very challenging to make nice, crisp, even beds like our growers are so good at. We're getting better at it though. This field was particularly difficult. Here it is at the end. This taught me strawberries are a very robust plant. They can survive a lot of adverse conditions. This is early in May 2020. Okay, so I'm gonna show you now one of our data points for Verticillium dahliae in the soil. That's going to be on the vertical axis. And then across the bottom, you see the non-treated plus the 4 fumigants. And then the timings, T1, which was pre-plant, or I'm sorry, pre-plant and pre-fumigation. T2 is post-fumigation but pre-plant. And then timings 3 and 4 are later on in the season. You can see the descriptions here on the right. So what you would expect, and I didn't want to show the bars just yet, what you'd expect is the levels pre-fumigation to be kind of even for all of the treatments, right? The field has been grown to different crops over the years, but never any fumigant in the field. And then you'd expect the one bar, the soil population immediately after fumigation to be the one with the greatest effects from the fumigant, and you'd expect the control to kind of be flat, right? It'd be the same before and after. But I'm prepping you for the data now because the data does not show that. The T1 is not the same through all the treatments. The T2 does not show the greatest differences. The control is relatively flat throughout. You don't see a difference between any of these samplings. So the more you sample and the more you measure and the more you look at soil populations of pathogens, I think the more confusing the picture becomes, because each sample is really looking at a very tiny portion of soil. Somebody asked earlier, for verticillium, just 2 colony forming units per gram of soil is enough to cause disease. And all but one of these is above that line. But you'll see, and we're growing a very susceptible variety, but we did not see that much disease, which is shown by this graph. This is the mortality rate over time, cumulative, and you can see that even at the final mortality, it's less than 1% for each of the treatments. So this is very puzzling because in a previous year in the same area, we had 100% mortality to this disease from using the same cultivar. So it's very confusing to me. We were expecting, 50 to 70% mortality here. So given the numbers of our soil populations, we should have seen higher levels of disease. So this is puzzling. And then looking at yield from that same field, these are the timings over here. The first 2 yield measurements were done last fall. The crop was just establishing. And then the next 2 were done this spring. And the first one was done before the plants had really ramped up their yield. And then this last one, they were yielding quite well. So no differences between treatments or among treatments, but obviously differences from the early versus the latest harvest. Okay.
We're going to go ahead and launch the poll first. There are a few questions, so we'll do those afterwards. I think if you guys want to take a look at the chat, Alex had a few. And
now we can answer the poll questions.
Yeah. We'll answer the poll first, and then you can we'll do some Q&A.
So the first question, it is the Pestalothiopsis that we saw in our diagnostic service that was new.
And the second question is about what conclusions did we draw? And unfortunately, yes, most everybody got it right. 75% said they were inconclusive. So the good news is about 80% of the reason for doing this project is the microbiome, and that still remains to be seen. So the correct answer was inconclusive.
There was a question about how Pestalothiopsis inoculum is disseminated. It's mainly by rain and irrigation, so keep eye on that, especially during the rainy season.
Okay.
There are a few questions in the Q&A.
Kelly mentions that Pestiloteuopsis is a leaf spot disease in Florida, not the crown and root rot form. When I was there and was looking at it, it was killing plants. How it was killing it, I guess I don't know if it was emerging from the crown or not. But in our case, we're not seeing it we didn't see it on the leaves. It was only isolated from the crown. This next question, do you believe that the lower disease symptoms shown in the experiment and the lower number of diagnosis samples received in the last year are related to the milder weather in 2020? I do think that has a lot to do with it. Mild weather always reduces soil-borne diseases. It's those stresses of heat and water drought, water stress that make the soil-borne diseases really flare up. So I think that has a lot to do with it, but it still, for me, doesn't explain our results using a highly susceptible variety in a field where there's plenty of, I'd like to see higher levels of verticillium, but there's enough out there to do it. So it's really got me puzzled.
Soil sampling scheme.
There was also a question about the soil sampling scheme. The soil cores were taken at a 6-inch depth for the root zone, and then we were taking 10 samples per bed. It's 150 feet of bed. We would combine those samples and then take 12 individual samples from that composited sample to do the measurements. So that's an extensive amount of sampling for the soil population. Okay, I think that's it.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, next in our program is Peter Henry. Peter's been working with the UC and now with USDA ARS on soil pathogens, and he is going to talk about his latest work. Peter.
All right. Yeah, thanks for inviting me to be here. Oleg, yeah, like Gerald said, I wish we could be in person, but this is the best we have for now. So like Oleg mentioned, my name is Peter Henry, and I run a lab studying soil-borne pathogens of strawberry at the USDA ARS in Salinas. I've been in this position for about a year, and prior to that, I did strawberry pathology research with Tom Gordon at UC Davis. And in the years that I've been working on strawberry pathology, I've seen the industry transition from using methyl bromide to other fumigants and alternative soil treatments. And with this transition came a need to use a systems-based approach for soil-borne disease control, which means relying on multiple complementary strategies, because a single effective approach, methyl bromide, is no longer available. So some of the most important variables of a systems-based approach are diagnostics, plastic type, soil treatment, either fumigation, ASD, or who knows, maybe we'll have steam available soon, cultivar choice, and crop rotation. And today I'll talk about just 4 of these, describing how decisions around these parameters can be leveraged to reduce disease. So the first step in any systems-based pathogen control is to determine what, if any, pathogens are present in the field. So the past history of that field is a really important indicator of whether or not lethal pathogens are present. And new DNA-based tools for pathogen detection were developed at the USDA ARS by Frank Martin to make this possible. And they're now in use along with other techniques at Cal Poly. So the Strawberry Center, like Chishika and Gerald mentioned, are running a diagnostic service that's free for all of you strawberry growers. So it's a really great resource to take advantage of. And private labs are also running diagnostic services as well. And I believe some of the labs can do detection from soil. So diagnosis is critical because all strategies for control depend the type of plastic that's used on beds can also have a large impact on disease development. So we saw this in the last growing season. This is an aerial image of a field taken with the drone using the same technique that Alex outlined before. So this is a 10-acre, 12-acre field. The drone flew over, and the disease is depicted as the amount of plant canopy cover in each of these little pixels. So over on the left, you can see the field is mostly green, which indicates that plants are overall quite healthy in these areas. Whereas in the right half of the field, there are many areas of really high disease, like these areas with red would have essentially no living plants, or yellow where there's a mixture of living and dead plants. So there's really high disease on this half, but not on that half. And the entire area was flat fumigated with the maximum rate of chlorpicrin after a 1-year lettuce rotation, and a susceptible cultivar Monterey was planted. So that basic management was applied to the entire field. The only thing that was different between the left and right half was the type of bed plastic that was used. On the left, the plants were grown under dark green plastic, which doesn't let light in and results in cooler soil temperatures, whereas the right half of the field was grown under clear plastic, or this so-called skunk plastics, or panda plastic, where it's black on the sides and clear on the top. And because it's clear, the sunlight can reach the bed and warm the soil, and that higher soil temperature can increase disease severity. So that was one field, but we actually saw this at 3 fields. Each of these fields is managed by the same grower. Each field is around 10 acres. Each field was pre-plant flat fumigated with chlorpicrin maximum rate. And field 1 I already showed you. Field 2 and 3 are additional images, and all of them were split into clear plastic and green plastic by the grower. So the grower had chosen to use both plastic types. And for each of these, above this dashed white line are plants grown under opaque dark green plastic, and below that white dashed line, clear plastic was used. So across multiple field sites, we see higher disease severity when clear plastic is used. And so this, underscores the potential risk of clear plastic, but it also could be that maybe those areas where clear plastic was used simply had more of the disease to begin with. So we wanted to look at that question. Is the same amount of the pathogen going to cause greater disease when clear plastic is used? That was our hypothesis. And to do that, we selected sites from each of these fields that span the range of being totally healthy to being very diseased, and quantified the amount of fusarium in each sample. So to do that, we worked with Oleg's group at UC Davis, Ana Maria Pastrana and Tom Gordon, to quantify fusarium, since they were already looking at this relationship. And then we also quantified disease severity as measured by vegetative index from the drone images. And with these 2 pieces of information, we could compare them and see, under clear plastic, does the same amount of fusarium cause greater disease severity? And I won't get too deep into the statistics, but indeed we did see that. So this vertical axis indicates plant health or vegetation. So the higher it is, the healthier the plants are, and the lower it is, the more diseased the plants are. And this horizontal axis indicates the abundance of the fusarium pathogen. So at 0, we didn't detect any of the pathogen, although potentially it was there below the detection threshold. And at these really high levels, there's a lot of the pathogen present. And so you see this trend where the plants overall are less healthy when there's more of the pathogen present. And the red line and red dots represent locations under clear plastic, whereas opaque represents locations under the blue represents locations under opaque plastic. So the takeaway here is that with the same amount of the pathogen in the field, you see higher disease severity when clear plastic is used. And actually, we've had some indications that temperatures, well, for a long time, we've known that temperature is an important factor in disease development, like Gerald just mentioned. And I just wanted to show this image because I thought it was really interesting. It was taken at, I took this photo at the MBA field site that the Strawberry Commission ran around 5 years ago. And on the right half of every bed, you can see the plants are dead or very severely diseased, whereas all the plants on the left side of the bed look much better. It's sort of this really puzzling pattern. And the main difference is that all the beds were oriented east-west. So the right side of the bed in this photo is exposed to more sunlight and greater heat from the sun. It's on the south side, whereas the left half of this bed would be cooler and have lower soil temperatures. So this is just another piece of evidence that connects to clear plastic, increasing bed temperatures, and increasing the risk of fusarium wilt disease. So just to wrap up, I'll talk about cultivar type and fumigation and how they can kind of be combined to get good yields. So plant resistance, it's been mentioned by Oleg and other presenters previously. It's a really key component of managing soil-borne diseases, especially the disease caused by fusarium. But fortunately, there are a number of resistant cultivars available. San Andreas and Fronteras are currently available, and these new UC varieties, Victor, Warrior, and Moxie, they're all resistant to fusarium. So this is a really great strategy. You don't have to plant it everywhere, but if you plant it where you have a lot of disease, that will help you. Many cultivars are susceptible. These are just a couple examples, Monterey and Cabrillo, and a couple of these new UC cultivars. So yeah, obviously this isn't the full spectrum of cultivars that are available, but there are a lot of resources on host resistance at the Cal Poly Strawberry Center website. They've done trials for the past several years comparing cultivars from several different breeding programs. From the California Strawberry Commission, like Joji mentioned, the UC Davis also has this information on their website. And if you're working with a private breeding company, just let them know what pathogen is present in your field, because all the Driscoll's, Lassen Canyon, et cetera, they all know this about their cultivars. And so if you tell them what pathogen you have, they can potentially find something that will work well for you at your site. So given that you can use a resistant cultivar to continue production in an infested field, we, through working with the grower, have found a really cost-effective fumigation strategy that relies on this. So this strategy was developed for back-to-back strawberry production. So it starts with last year's crop still in the ground. Metam potassium is applied as a crop termination treatment. So this is after metam potassium treatment, the plants are wilting and dying after that. And compared to flat fumigation, this would save $3,000 or $4,000 per acre. After that, the plants are mowed, plastic and drip tape are removed, and the beds are tilled individually. So instead of chiseling and ripping across the entire field to work up all of the soil and then having to list new beds, our grower collaborator Miguel Ramos developed this system where just the center of each bed is tilled, and under each of these flaps is a rototiller. And so let's see. So that's how it works, just going through the field and tilling the center of each bed. Once that's done, you can plant directly into this tilled soil and lay plastic, drip tape, and start your production season. So just avoiding chiseling and ripping and relisting beds could save you around $1,000 an acre. It really depends on your equipment, but that's a possibility. So we compared this is with metapotassium crop termination, and we compared it to the grower standard of flat fumigation with maximum rate chlorpicrin with trichlor. And neither treatment was sufficient to get good yields in a susceptible cultivar, whereas for resistant cultivars, we saw very good yield and essentially no difference between the treatments. There was a slight difference in July where chlorpicrin treated areas with San Andreas growing had slightly higher yield, but it wasn't a large difference. And this is the total yield over the season. This is measured in 8-pound boxes per acre. So each cultivar is listed here, and each cultivar was treated with either chlorpicrin flat fumigation or metapotassium KPAM crop termination bed treatment. And the yields for the resistant cultivars were consistent with what you would get in an uninfested field. So Fronteras was yielding around 11,000 boxes per acre, and San Andreas, we got 8,000 or 9,000 boxes per acre. So the grower was doing quite well with those. Whereas Monterey and Cabrillo, neither fumigation treatment was enough to save these. So maximum, 6,000 boxes per acre. That shows you that flat fumigation alone in all sites does not control fusarium. So this system's approach combines using a resistant cultivar with a cost-effective fumigation treatment, crop termination, and generates essentially the same yield as the grower standard or the normal standard of flat fumigation with chlorpicrin. So just to drive the message home, my key takeaways are that fumigation alone is not 100% effective at controlling soil-borne disease. We need to look at multiple complementary strategies. Clear plastic can increase the risk of fusarium, and it's likely that it would for other soil-borne pathogens as well, but I don't have that data available. And there are cultivars that can resist disease caused by soil-borne pathogens. So those are the key takeaway points. And with that, I'd like to thank all the collaborators and funding sources that made this work possible, and move to questions.
We're gonna do your poll real quick while people take some time to put their questions in the Q&A. We'll just have this poll up for a quick minute, so go ahead and submit your answers.
So should I go to the Q&A?
Sure, if you want to take a look at the questions and be ready for them.
Great, yeah, so first question, does flat fumigation with maximum rate chlorpicrin always control fusarium? We got 100% success rate on that question. Great job, everyone. No, it does not. 2, choose another possible method for fusarium wilt disease control. So the options were cultivar resistance to fusarium, 67% said that. Opaque bed plastics instead of clear, 33% answered with that. And asking the fungus to go away, I have not seen that work, although I'm sure many people wish it just would. So great job, everyone who answered these questions. So there are a couple Q&A questions. So Lisa asked if there is a relationship between plastic film color and disease severity or incidence with other soil-borne pathogens, and with whether or not thickness matters. Yeah, I haven't seen that work done, and I would expect thickness to impact this, where a thicker, potentially a thicker plastic that increase the soil temperature to a less extent, yeah, might be better for disease control. And one of the interesting things about this is clear plastic is used for a reason. It's supposed to increase yield, and especially early season yield, and that's really important for hitting a good price point with your berries. And but I've gone back to some of the literature and actually Bringhurst, the old UC Davis strawberry breeder, looked at this in the 1970s and found that there were certain cultivars that, you know, had slower production, but made up for that later in the season. So, yeah, so I think it's also worth looking at the yield curve under different plastics and thickness, et cetera. And then Anamik asked, is the relationship between inoculum levels and disease nonlinear? It looks like symptoms are relatively flat until a higher inoculum level. And yeah, so essentially, and this is very similar to what Oleg showed as well, that the plants can withstand a small amount of this pathogen in the field. So just because you don't see disease doesn't mean that there's none of it there. And potentially that could explain why Fusarium appears so suddenly. You know, I've talked to a lot of growers who said they had never seen Fusarium in their field before, and then the next year it was really bad. And it could be that it was there in the prior season, just at a lower level, and just took a while to build up. So I think, yeah, the work Oleg's doing is really important. And so hopefully he can answer the question about whether or not the relationship is linear or nonlinear.
Peter, can I comment on the plastic that came up? We looked at it. You know, dark plastic doesn't control disease or you know, somehow makes your plants healthier. It delays the progression of disease. And I think it has to do with things like, obviously, soil temperature triggers how fast the root system grows and how much of the root system is in contact with pathogen. So if it slows down, disease slows down. Also, the larger, more productive plants in a clear mulch systems will have higher level of stress. They have berries earlier, more fruit per plant, higher transpiration rates, and all those stress factors would contribute to disease development, disease progression in those plants, we believe.
Yeah, totally. Like those, all of those stressors are important. There's a lot of work coming out of other Fusarium wilt pathosystems, so Fusarium wilt of celery, Fusarium wilt of lettuce, that show that the fungus actually grows better at these higher temperatures. So there's definitely an effect of the temperature on the activity of the fungus as well, in addition to all those stresses. And it's a subtle thing. It's a lot more subtle in effect than, you know, than the cultivar that you choose, whether or not it's resistant or whether or not you fumigate. Obviously, those are going to have really big effects. But yeah, the point of showing the data on those fields is to show that there are a number of cases that are borderline, where if you use an opaque plastic, it can delay the symptoms such that you are avoiding disease and still having profitable return. Actually, that grower had stopped picking from the clear plastic areas late in the season because the fruit quality was declining as well. So even though the plants weren't totally dead, the fruit quality was poor enough that he had to abandon that part of the field. So.
Okay. Was any more questions or comments? I think we're getting close to wrapping up. Thank you very much. It's a good time to thank Kelly and all the program support folks who made this meeting possible for us. Like I said, we got DPR credits, they're approved. You just need to, if you need them, to submit the simple test and get your score, and they'll be taken care of. So hopefully it works out for everybody, and I appreciate everybody's patience being on this meeting. It's a different beast, and we're able to get through it almost on time. So hope you have a healthy and safe day and productive weekend and following week. So thanks again, and if any questions, let me know, but I think we're ready to wrap it up and say goodbyes.